I want to thank everybody for joining us for this first ever legal seminar entitled the KCA Medicine Lodge Summit. My name is Arvo Mikkonen. I'm the president of the Oklahoma Indian Bar Association, and we have a initiative that we call the Article 6 Project. And what the Article 6 Project is to bring attention to Article 6 of the United States Constitution. Many of us hear on the news and in talking to many other people, lawyers, and just the general public, we hear quite frequently about the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, other amendments. Article 6 is a provision in the United States Constitution that says basically that treaties are the supreme law of the land, and every judge in every state is bound thereby. And so as our initiative, we are trying to educate not only Native people, but also non-Native people and our leaders. Do they believe in the Constitution? Do they back the Constitution? Next time you run into a political figure or an elected official, ask them if they support the United States Constitution. That's question number one. Second question is, do you support Article 6? You might get a look back when they start thinking, well, what are you talking about? And that's where the education starts. That's where the understanding starts. Because as many of you know, treaties are not as old as the United States Constitution, and people speak every day about their constitutional rights. But then you talk about treaties and they'll say, well, treaties are really old. They're from a long time ago. Well, actually, they're more recent than our Constitution. So if we're going to talk about our constitutional rights in a daily fashion, then we should also recognize and talk about our treaty rights. So that was really the genesis for this seminar that we have today. It's an important thing to not only educate the general public, but especially our own people. And I spoke with some of the other presenters that we're going to have this afternoon, Kirk Kickingbird, Rylan Revis, Stephanie Hudson, and we're some of the original people that worked in getting our tribal court systems up and running, in getting our rights recognized. And a lot of the current generation really doesn't know that history. And so we thought it important to pass that history on, pass on some of our knowledge. We are recording this today, so hopefully it will be something that is going to be preserved. And when our people encounter other elected officials, other people in the community, they will understand our history. And it is a very complicated history. It's a very rich history. So I just want to acknowledge, I know that we have representatives of, and I'm not going to name people by name, but you know who you are. We have representatives from all three tribes, Kiowas, Comanches, and Apaches here. And we have about 120 people that are watching on Zoom. So we have quite a few people outside of this venue. And I especially want to thank, at the outset, the University of Oklahoma Law School for hosting this event and showing the initiative and the insight into sharing this information that we're going to be passing on to you. I would especially like to thank Dean Kathleen Guzman. She's been extremely supportive. I was surprised and pleased to find out that she got our 3 flags from our 3 nations, and raise your hand. And that was a very nice gesture. And so at the conclusion of our event, I hope that you learn about OU's programs. They've got some Indian law programs here. There's some brochures out on the table. And also especially thank Dean Guzman for hosting us today. So we have quite a bit of information to get through. I'm going to be kicking it off after I finish my presentation. Then we're taking this chronologically. It'll be Kirk Kickingbird, And then after Kirk Kickingbird will be Ryland Rivas Sr. And then after Ryland will be Stephanie Hudson Burkhart. And I'm not going to go into a long explanation of our background, and you can read our bios on the materials. Really, we want to get into the substantive part of our program. So let me change the PowerPoint here, if I can get to the screen. All right, this photograph, actually it's not a photograph, it's a painting, was actually painted representing the Medicine Lodge Treaty that was held. So that's why we are using that as our logo and graphic for this presentation. Okay, I'm going to cover historically, going way back, so that we all have a good idea of the treaties that many of us have entered into. And I've learned some things along the way, and I think that this is just absolutely fascinating to realize that we have a long history of alliances. The Comanches negotiated treaties with the Spaniards back in the 16th century. A lot of people don't know that. There were some that were executed and agreements reached in the 1700s between the Comanches and Spanish settlers, Mexico. And also, it's interesting to note that unlike the Kiowas, who are basically one unified group, and then the Plains Apaches, who were basically a subgroup allied with the Kiowa that were really not a entirely separate tribe, but did maintain their own language and their own customs. The Comanches were really more organized into different bands. And so it's interesting to go through when we look at these treaties. In some instances, it was not signed by all of the bands. It was just signed by one band and not another. And that was one of the complicated things to understand, that even though there might have been an agreement with one band, it didn't apply to everybody. So if you don't know, there are basically 5 major bands of the Comanches, and I'm not going to pronounce them because I probably will not do it justice, but there were the Honey Eater bands, the second bands and basically these were different geographic areas. The Noyeka band, or Nakoni, the Buffalo Eaters band, the Quahati, or Antelopes, and the Yampeckera. Now, I'm Kiowa and Comanche, but I'm more familiar with the Kiowa side, so I apologize if I didn't pronounce those correctly. That was the Root Eater band. So again, when we look at these treaties, we have to realize which band signed an actual treaty. As I mentioned, the Comanches had various agreements with Spaniards that had settled in this area, that had come up from the Mexico region. And also, they were also able to research, and there was an ethnologist named James Mooney who documented the fact that one of the first alliances that the Kiowas had with the Comanches was actually back in about 1790. And it's an interesting story if you research it. Of course, the Kiowas and Comanches used to be enemies. We were not always allied, but back in this around the year 1790, there was an instance where there was a group of Kiowas and a group of Comanches who were at this one location. And they did not know, actually they were in a building, and they didn't know, one side didn't know that the other was there. And the individual that was essentially hosting them realized that they were about to get into it, and negotiated a basic alliance between the two tribes, between the Comanches that were there and the Kiowas that were there. And that alliance has lasted all of this time. So a lot of people don't even know about that story. It's pretty interesting. Of course, the Comanches migrated away from the Shoshone tribe. The Comanches are a Shoshonean group, and their language is very similar to the Shoshone. They were up around central part of Wyoming and migrated to the southern plains. And you can see the map here that shows how they went down through Colorado and eventually ended up in western Texas and western Oklahoma. The Kiowas originally originated in Canada on the east side of the Rocky Mountains, north of the Canadian border, and migrated down along the east side of the Rocky Mountains, moving south. Of course, the Kiowas encountered the Crow Indians, the Crow Nation, and there was an alliance that developed there that still lasts to this day. This is a map showing the location of the Kiowas, and that is documented from particular sun dances and interviews that were done in the 1800s by James Mooney, who was a representative from the Smithsonian Institution who lived with the Kiowa. Actually, he lived with some relatives of mine, I since have found out, and had documented through our calendars and our history exactly where our sun dances were held, and was able to pinpoint the trek down from the northern plains to the southern plains. If you take a look at really right before non-Indians reached settlement in the central part of the United States, this is basically the location of where the Kiowa and Comanche and Apache were. Of course, we exerted a lot of control over a vast area, and we're largely moving, following buffalo herds, of course. And that is part of the reason why our reservations ultimately ended up where we are in the Indian Territory, ultimately to become Oklahoma. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about treaties. One of the questions that oftentimes people ask is, what is an Indian tribe? Is it a part of the state? Is it part of the federal government? Is it a separate nation? And in these two cases that came from the United States Supreme Court, Worcester versus Georgia and Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, the United States Supreme Court ultimately decided that Indian tribes really weren't foreign nations, but they weren't part of the state either. They were somewhere in between a foreign nation and a state. And John Marshall, who was the author of both of these decisions, came up with the definition of an Indian tribe being a domestic dependent nation. So technically, we are domestic dependent nations. We have more powers than a state does, because you don't make a treaty between a state and a nation. You only make treaties between nations. And of course, many of the treaties that preceded some of our treaties, particularly those with some of the tribes in the eastern part of the United States, the Cherokees and the Choctaws, and Seminoles, Creeks, Chickasaws, the decision there was recognition of treaty making as essentially recognizing our status as being a domestic dependent nation beyond the authority of states. So one of the first treaties that we had, is there a way to get rid of this bar at the top, because it's blocking out a lot of the oh, there we go. Thank you. So one of our first treaties that came up involving either the Kiowas, Comanches, or Apaches with the United States was in 1835. And essentially what happened was Secretary of War Cass decided to send representatives of the United States out to the center part of the plains to negotiate a treaty because of people that were moving westward, and also there was quite a few instances of different tribes actually having battles with one another and having disputes over land, etc. So the plan was to send a delegation to Fort Gibson, and which ultimately is located in the Indian Territory. and there was a group that was sent out. The commission consisted of this individual, Montford Stokes, who was an Indian agent, and some military officials. And they were going to meet the tribes at Fort Gibson, which was one of the nearest posts to the western frontier. This was a letter that was sent, basically giving the instructions to enter into a treaty with, particularly with the Comanches and the Kiowas. But the decision was also made to have the treaty include other tribal groups. And those of you that know tribal history, there was a longstanding feud essentially between the Kiowas and the Osages as a result of various skirmishes that ultimately culminated in what was called the Cutthroat Gap Massacre, where quite a few Osages attacked the Kiowas and killed quite a few tribal members. And that was right at this same time frame. So the government wanted not only to enter into some type of relations with the Kiowas and the Comanches, but also wanted to include some of the other tribes that were being moved from the east into the Indian Territory, and also some of the tribes that were already here, such as the Osages. So the first treaty was originally going to be held at Fort Gibson, but there was a decision that was made to move it to another location that was closer to where the tribes were located. And actually, it's located very close to Wewoka, today's Wewoka. It was a fort called Camp Holmes. And the reason that was done was because prior representations were made to the Kiowas and Comanches that we were going to meet you, but we were going to meet you closer to where you were located. And so the decision was made to have the treaty negotiations take place at Camp Holmes, which was near the Canadian River on the western part of the Creek Nation, and very close to Wewoka. This was a speech that was given by one of the chiefs of the Comanches, who basically said, yes, we're interested in peace. We want to have good relations with the United States. And again, I'm not sure exactly which band he was affiliated with. Sometimes it's documented, sometimes it's not. But he decided that he was going to go ahead and represent the Comanches and sign this treaty with the United States. And you can see on the map there exactly where this fort was that the meeting took place. So the meeting took place in August of 1835. There were about 250 United States troops there. The Kiowas were also there. However, they took so long to get things underway. The Kiowas decided to leave because they were running out of food, and they decided to go hunting. So the Comanches were there and some of the other tribes, but by the time the commissioners got around to speaking with the assembled Indians, the Kiowas had already left, and essentially this is documented in this letter on September 15th, 1835, where the commissioners wrote to the Secretary of War that we're sorry to let you know the Kiowas are not here anymore. They can't sign a treaty, so we didn't get our assignment accomplished. There was a Kiowa warrior that went to Fort Gibson and ultimately spoke with some of the representatives of the United States. And the question was whether or not the Kiowas would actually join this treaty that the Comanches had already signed. Some time went by. In 1836, the Kiowas did not come to Fort Gibson. Ultimately, the officials that were originally in charge of negotiating these treaties, one of them passed away, Major Armstrong, and so the assignment to negotiate this treaty, the first treaty with the Kiowas, was given to this Colonel Shoto. He had some experience in the frontier. And this was a letter to Colonel Shoto from the Secretary of War of the United States. And he said basically, The Comanches were very upset and concerned about what's going on because all of a sudden there were a lot of other Indians moving into their territory. And of course, who are those? That's the 5 tribes that have been relocated to Oklahoma and other tribes that have been moved here to Oklahoma. Of course, this is not just vacant property. The Kiowas and Comanches and Osages and Wichitas were already here. And now here come all these other tribes from the eastern part of the United States. And this letter documents the fact that the Comanches were very upset about these other tribes moving into their territory. And there was concern that there would be retaliation between the tribes because now some of the 5 tribes are in the area of the Kiowas and Comanches. This map documents the original treaties that were signed by the United States with the Chickasaws, Creeks, Seminoles, and Choctaws and Cherokees, which show that, of course, their original reservations in those treaties, those removal treaties, went all the way to the western part of the Indian Territory. And of course, most of those tribes ultimately located in the eastern part of the Indian Territory. So a delegation ultimately arrived of Kiowas and Apaches at Fort Gibson on May 18th. And there were also some other Wichitas that were there. And ultimately, a treaty was signed on May 20th of 1837 between the United States and the Kiowas and Apaches and some of the other tribes. If you look at the treaty, the names of the chiefs that signed the treaty, most of them you may not recognize except for Del Hassan, who was one of the chiefs that came into power after the Cutthroat Gap Massacre. Prior to that time, it was Chief Adate, who was actually my great-great-grandfather, who was the chief of the tribe. But his is the only name that's most people will recognize on that treaty. Now, remember, during this period of time, Texas it was essentially an independent nation. Wasn't part of the United States. The Republic of Texas declared its essential independence. And throughout the entire time, the relations between the United States and the tribes and Texas, there were various times where Texas really wasn't part of the United States. And of course, during the Confederate times, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, Texas was viewed by the Kiowas and Comanches as essentially a foreign power, a different from the United States. And so their attitudes towards Texas and Mexico were very different than the attitudes towards the United States. And this followed, obviously, because Texas was a foreign country. Texas, between 1836 and 1846, was not part of the United States. It was a separate republic. So this is what was the treaty that was ultimately signed? Was there a land exchange? No. Was there a reservation created? No. Essentially, it was, again, a treaty of alliances and a treaty to try to keep the peace on the frontier. And the reference here, the Kataka, that's actually the Apaches, but that's how it's written in the treaty. And so they signed this treaty with the United States and some of the other tribes. Basically, in the first 3 articles, it's, let's keep the peace. Let's not act hostile towards one another. Also, the United States wanted to make sure that its citizens would be protected. And so that was one of the things that they would be looking at, is whether or not the tribes would be able to enter into this treaty and not either attack or bother United States citizens coming through. And then the treaty also recognized that the Republic of Mexico and Texas were out there, and understood that the tribes had relations with both the Republic of Mexico and Texas, and nothing in the treaty should affect any of those relations. This Article 4 of the treaty guaranteed hunting rights, and basically from the Cross Timbers. The Cross Timbers was a landmark referred to quite frequently. The Cross Timbers were basically the central part of Oklahoma, where the trees were the thickest before you get to more open plains on the western side of the state. So there's a lot of references to the Cross Timbers. So this reference in Article 4 says that the tribes have the free right to hunt from the Cross Timbers out to the western edge of the United States, which obviously is a pretty expansive area. Again, in a lot of the treaties, you'll see that, you know, if one side, either the United States or the tribes, you know, commit some kind of crime or take property or something like that, they agree to compensate the other side. So again, all of this is really trying to establish good relations between the United States and these tribes. And again, Article 7, you can see they're talking about horse stealing, any kind of other crimes that might take place against the Indians or the Indians might commit. There's a concern there to make sure that each side compensates each other or takes appropriate action to hold those individuals responsible. There were gifts exchanged most of the time whenever these treaties were signed. There were sometimes money or other goods or gifts exchanged. That's very common. Again, there's this reference to respecting the rights of Mexico and Texas, and nothing in the treaty would affect whether or not the tribes could still travel into Mexico or Texas. So that's the treaty as it was written. Very short treaty, so it's really a treaty of alliance. This is a interesting map. This basically shows the geographic rough locations of all the different bands of Comanche that I mentioned earlier, so that you can get an idea for where exactly which band was located. I found this treaty, and I had never even heard of this. I think this is very interesting. So there were a lot of German immigrants that went to Texas, Texas particularly, and there was a treaty that was made between a land company that basically was, they received a Texas land grant, and they were mostly Germans, and they signed a treaty with one of the bands of the Comanches, and signed it just like any of these other treaties, you know, with the United States. Promised basically free passage to Comanches through their territory, and also promised that any of their settlers would not be bothered, at least by this band of Comanches. The Comanches requested a representative of the German colonists come and serve as an intermediary and live with them. And actually, there was a representative from this German community that went and lived near the camp of one of the chiefs, Santa Anna. So here we see a treaty being made between a private group and at least one of the bands of Comanches. The other thing that's interesting is, of course, you know, those of you that know your history, the Confederacy was developing. And of course, once the Confederate States decided to secede from the Union, it was very important for them to try to get alliances, not only with between the states, but also with the tribes. There were actually about 9 treaties signed by the Confederacy with different Indian groups. And many of you may have heard those references to treaties talking about this treaty will be in place for as long as the grass grows or the rivers flow. There's no treaty with the United States that says that. Almost all of the treaties with the Confederacy have that language. So whenever you hear that language, that's coming from a treaty with the Confederate States of America. So the Confederacy was, of course, very desirous of getting the tribes on their side as well. And of course, what happened ultimately, not just with some of the tribes in the western part of the Indian Territory, but on the eastern side as well, some of the tribes split. So those of you that know your history will realize that, some parts of the Cherokee Nation were on the side of the Union, some parts were on the side of the Confederacy. Same thing with some of the other 5 tribes. And so there was not necessarily one part of the tribe that was unified in terms of whether or not they were allied with the Union or the Confederacy. So the Confederate States sent out a gentleman named Albert Pike. He was their commissioner, and he went to meet actually at the Wichita Agency and was tasked with trying to get as many of the tribes in the western part of Oklahoma or the Indian Territory then to enter into good relations with the Confederate States. And so you can see here, this treaty, which included the Comanches, also included the Wichitas, the Caddos, some of the other sometimes referred to as the affiliated tribes, some of the tribes that are affiliated with the Wichitas that are listed there, and the Shawnees and the Delawares. So this treaty reads very much like some of the treaties with the United States. The first article basically says that they're going to be protected by the Confederacy, protected by the Confederate States of America in peace and in war. They promise, the Confederacy promised to ally with the tribes and protect them from the Union if the Union were to come in and attack or do something. There were already reservations, of course, set up for some of the tribes, and essentially Article 3 of this treaty of 1861 says that the reserves that are already in place will stay as they are unless those tribes are not satisfied with those reserves. And if they want to move or change boundaries, then they can do that. They would have to approach the Confederacy. Now, of course, those boundaries were set up by the United States, by the Union. So I don't know how that exactly would have worked. I guess if the South had won, then that would have been very important. So you can see, of course, here, this is a map of the Confederacy, the southern states, and Indian Territory is, smack dab right in the middle of that geographic area. So it's obvious why Texas and the Confederacy was interested in getting the tribes aligned on their side. Article 4 talks about, designating where people are going to live, the different tribes, and they can decide to live, together or separately. And Article 5 guarantees that the tribe should have the right to possess the reserved that's already allocated or allotted to it. And again, there's that language, as long as the grass shall grow and the water run. There were hunting rights that were guaranteed. Of course, hunting rights were very important all throughout this period of time. The ability to travel and to hunt, follow buffalo was very important to the tribes. So that was contained in Article 6. And the tribes that were listed included, like I said, all of the tribes. Article 8 talks about being good neighbors with one another, basically guaranteeing that, if there were wrongs committed, crimes, thefts, that kind of thing, that each side would hold their side responsible. And then it talks about also the other tribes that were not signing on to this treaty that were in the area. And so Article 9 talks about the tribes that are signing the treaties essentially agree to respect the Cherokee, the Muskogee, the Seminole, Choctaw, and Chickasaw nations, and they would not cause them any problems. And also, if there were any killings or crimes or thefts, that they would return that property to those nations. Article 10 is interesting because, of course, the five tribes had an elaborate system of government and laws and courts and light horse police. But this treaty, the Confederacy says that the laws of the Choctaws and the Chickasaws will not apply in your area. There was essentially this region that was called the least district, which was the western part of the Cherokee, or actually the Chickasaw and Choctaw nations. And there was a dispute between the Choctaws and the Chickasaws as to actually who owned what. They were kind of together initially. But it said very clearly here, their laws don't apply. We're not going to recognize their laws. So you don't have to worry about their laws affecting you. There was also a guarantee in Article 12 that if that the Confederacy would keep people out of the tribal areas. And so if they were going north of the Red River, they essentially would not be permitted to do that. So if there were any people, non-Indians, moving north of the Red River, then the Confederacy would not allow that to take place, and would not permit people to move into the Indian reservations north of the Red River. Article 14 talks about saying that we're not asking for anything. We just, you stay where you are, we'll stay where we are, and we'll just continue to maintain relations for as long as the Confederacy lasts, which, of course, 4 years later, the Confederacy, came to an end. Article 19, and I skipped some, was pretty interesting because the Confederacy included the provision to provide every tribal warrior a gun if they didn't have one, and they were promised to not give them to anyone else. So Article 20 talks about the Kiowas. The Kiowas did not sign this treaty, but they were essentially asking the Comanches to kind of urge the Kiowas to join in this treaty. So there's a provision specifically in Article 20 that promotes the idea that the tribes will stay on their reservations. They won't leave. They won't go hunting or go on raids. There's a suggestion made that you might suggest to the Kiowas that they join the treaty as well. The other thing that was included in this treaty was that any troops from Texas were not permitted to be north of the Red River, and then they had to stay south of the Red River in the area of the Confederacy. The next treaty that was made, of course, the Confederacy came to an end in 1865, and so all of those treaties really weren't applicable any longer. So the United States comes back in and starts to sign additional treaties with the Kiowas and Comanches and Apaches. And it's interesting here, that's the way they spelled Comanche in the treaty, so I left it just as it is. This was a treaty of 1853 that was signed in Fort Atkinson, Kansas. And again, like a lot of the other treaties, Article 1 talks about peace, friendship, and amity, good relations. They essentially promise in Article 2 that the tribes will maintain peace and have goodwill and friendship with the United States. Article 3 starts talking about specifics, because at this point in time, the United States is starting to put railroads and cattle trails and highways through some of the Indian lands. And Article 3 is trying to guarantee that the tribes are not going to interfere with the construction of railroads or cattle paths or other things that started to come into their territory. Article 5 talks about, again, trying to keep the tribes on the reservations or on their areas and not travel to go to Texas or Mexico. Again, That was a concern of the United States that the tribes are going down into Mexico and going elsewhere. And so this was really the first reference in a treaty that suggests that the tribes need to stay in a certain area. Article 6 provides for some payments that are made. And this again begins some of the what are called annuities, which are basically payments in either goods or money to the tribes as a result of signing the treaty. Article 7 is really an obligation of the United States to protect tribal members and protect the Indian nations from any citizens of the United States who commit what are called depredations or commit crimes. The United States is basically agreeing that they're going to keep their people away from the tribes, and also if there's some kind of harm, that the United States will be responsible to compensate the tribes or the families involved with whatever took place. And that's a picture of the actual fort where the treaty was signed. This was a small fort in Kansas that didn't last very long. Ultimately, it was abandoned. But that's an actual picture of the fort. Article 10 starts talking about this idea of farming, and you'll see this common theme that becomes even more prevalent in later treaties, where the United States is trying to promote farming, trying to convert migratory buffalo hunters into farmers. Of course, some tribes were agricultural. Kiowas, Comanches, and Apaches were not. But there is a push here to get the idea of farming taking place. Okay, so that was 1853. Now we're in 1865. And the next treaty that was entered into was the Treaty of the Little Arkansas that was signed on the Little Arkansas River in Kansas, October of 1865. And that was included some of the bands of the Comanche and included the Kiowas. And again, Article 1 talks about perpetual peace between the tribes and the United States. There's provisions about how do we resolve disputes, or if there are depredations or crimes committed against each other. Each side will hold the other responsible for payment or payment of injury. They have to be delivered up to the authorities and dealt with. Now, Article 2 is the first time that we start talking about land and boundaries. Article 2 is the first reference to creation of essentially what is a reservation. And Article 2 talks about describing a particular area that the tribe essentially is going to have to stay in, both the Kiowas and the Comanches and the Apaches. So they talk and they have a land description. I'll show you a map in a moment so you can see exactly where it was. But this is Article 2 is the establishment of the first Kiowa Comanche Apache reservation. And so there's a guarantee in Article 2 that this area is set apart for the absolute and undisturbed use and occupation of the tribes, and talks about the government setting up representatives, employees, agents that are going to be located on the reservation. And also there are guarantees for these officers and employees ultimately who become, Indian agents or other representatives of the United States that are going to be living on the reservation and basically administering and monitoring what's going on. There's also a provision which is kind of interesting in here that talks about the tribes have to stay away, at least 10 miles away from any traveled routes. So railroads, paths, cattle drive routes, the tribes have to stay at least 10 miles away from all of those locations. Article 3, again, talks about the original lands that were essentially given up as a result of signing this treaty. So the lands outside of the reservation. And there's a provision here in Article 3 that says, even though we're establishing this reservation, the parties are expressly permitted to reside upon and range at pleasure outside of the reservation where the hunting grounds were and other locations south of the Arkansas River. And it talks about roads and highways and other things going through, not to be disturbed. Article 5 talks about the, again, annual, for a term of 40 years, there's going to be a payment made that's going to be $10 per person, essentially for signing this treaty. Provided they comply with the treaty. So again, these money payments start as a way to the United States trying to enforce these treaties, and it provides for those payments and when they're going to be paid. Now, the Apaches in this treaty in 1865 decided to essentially disassociate themselves with the Kiowas and Comanches. And there's a separate treaty. The second treaty was signed where the Apaches said, we don't want to be with the Kiowas and Comanches anymore. We want to join the Cheyennes and Arapahoes. And I've never really been able to figure out exactly why that was. I have a suspicion, and from some of the references, and if anybody knows, I'd like to hear it. But the Apaches apparently were being held responsible for a lot of the things that the Kiowas and Comanches were doing that was against what the United States was wanting, and so they were essentially being blamed for some of the things that the Kiowas and Comanches were doing, and so they decided to join the Cheyennes and Arapahoes. Well, you'll see what happens 2 years after that. Okay, so this is the very first reservation. And so you can see that location takes up most of western Oklahoma and most of the Texas Panhandle. So it's a pretty large area. And again, the tribes really didn't stay in this area. A lot of the tribes hunting went on raids into Texas and Mexico, notwithstanding the fact that there was a reservation established. All right, so if you look at this map, the light shaded area is essentially what the United States ultimately recognized at the time, and ultimately when we had some land claims, these were the areas that were considered to be the Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache Aboriginal title area, that entire location. Most of west and central Texas, parts of Kansas, Colorado, New Mexico. And so the dark shaded in box is that first treaty that was established in 1865. So that gives you an idea of exactly where this is located. Well, it wasn't but 2 years later that we had another initiative, which was an attempt by the United States again to further constrict the tribe, further take more land, and impose a lot of other conditions on the Kiowas and the Comanches, and ultimately the Apaches. So this is the Medicine Lodge Treaty. This was the last treaty that was signed. Medicine Lodge is located in Kansas. Essentially there were a series of treaties made. There was a treaty made between the Cheyenne and Arapaho in the United States. There was a treaty with the Kiowas and Comanches, which I'll go through. And there was another treaty where the Apaches decided to come back to join the Kiowas and Comanches again. I'm not sure why they didn't stay with the Cheyenne and Arapahoes. I did see some references that, again, the Cheyenne and Arapahoes were doing a lot of the same thing that the Kiowas and Comanches were doing, and so the Apaches decided to come back to be with the Kiowas and Comanches. So again, there were two treaties. This is an actual depiction of one of the locations where the treaty was signed. And again, there was an artist that was there that captured that drawing of the different speeches that were made and the negotiations that took place. This is a representation from one of the Kiowa calendars of this particular treaty. And as many of you know, there were quite a few Kiowas that kept pictographic calendars. And this was a representation of the Medicine Lodge Treaty from one of the Kiowa calendars. And you can see the non-Indian there with the hat on, shaking hands with the Indian. So what did the treaty do? And we'll go through some of the provisions. Basically, again, more restricted area, more government officials located on the reservation. There were provisions limiting hunting rights, and we'll talk about that. And the biggest result of the treaty was giving up that first reservation in return for the reservation in southwestern Indian Territory. So we'll go through a lot of these. Okay, again, Article 1 talks about, peace and good relations between the tribes and the United States. Again, this is what's sometimes referred to in the law as a bad man clause. The second part of Article 1, which says if somebody commits a crime against the tribes or the other way around, that they'll be delivered up and held responsible. Article 2 of the treaty describes the description of the reservation as established by the Medicine Lodge Treaty. And I'll show you a map of what that looks like. Also, it says that the United States would agree that no person, no non-Indians would be allowed in the reservation. So settlers couldn't come in. The only people that would be authorized to be on the reservation would be government employees or others permitted to pass through with federal approval. Article 3 is the first time that we see a reference to what ultimately is referred to as an allotment. Again, the policy of the federal government at this time was trying to promote farming. And there's a provision in Article 3 which talks about we're going to set this land aside for you, but we're going to make sure that there's at least 160 acres of quote unquote tillable land for all the tribal members. And if it's not enough, then we'll make adjustments. If there's not enough land for at least 160 acres for each person living. Article 4 talks about all of these federal government employees and representatives that are going to be on the reservation, physicians, agents, and the physician provision is really the genesis of the obligation of the United States to provide tribes health services. That's where it comes from these treaty guarantees that says we're going to provide for your health services. That's where it comes from. That's a guarantee that's still applicable today. We gave up all of these lands, millions and millions of acres, in return for something. In return for what? Well, at that time, it was a physician. Now it's for, the hospital and the services, the Indian Health Service. There were also other things, carpenters and other representatives. There was a provision in Article 5 that there was going to be an agency set up that would be an office, permanent office, that would be a representative of the United States, designated to essentially administer the reservation and be a representative. Article 6 is again further talking about the idea of farming. And it says basically if anybody wants to take up farming, any of the tribal heads of families, they can pick an area of 320 acres within the reservation to essentially create their own farm, so that it wouldn't be commonly owned land. It would be land that would be owned by that individual tribal member. And so there's this idea again of individualization of the commonly owned tribal lands that's in this treaty. Article 7 is the first reference to schools, Indian schools. And there's a provision in this treaty that basically says that you're going to have to promise that you start sending your children to school and to the schools that are established on the reservation. And you can see right after that highlighted yellow part, it's the duty of the agent to make sure that this stipulation is strictly complied with. So again, this is part of the assimilation process that's taking root here, where Indian schools are established again to quote unquote ensure the civilization of the tribes. Article 8 talks about, again, this idea of farming. If you're going to take up a farm, we'll provide you seeds and hoes and plows and other things up to $100. And so that was an incentive for people to take up farming rather than continuing to be buffalo hunters. Article 10 talks about annuities, again, payments of money that would be made. And in this provision, it says 1,865, or actually on that date, the prior treaty that was made on the Little Arkansas, the treaty in 1865, instead of getting money, they changed the formula and said, okay, instead of getting money, which we did in the prior treaty, we're going to give you a coat, flannel shirt, socks, a hat, and pantaloons, and then fabric for each female. And then the same thing for children. So rather than getting money, we're trying to promote, dressing in Western style clothing. Article 11, again, this is a punitive provision which said the parties stipulate that they will relinquish all right to occupy anything outside the reservation. So we lost all of the prior land that was designated in the 1865 treaty, and we had to stay on the reservation. But you can hunt, but what's the provision? Well, just as long as the buffalo are in such numbers as to justify the chase. So that's kind of a sunset provision, because everybody knew at that point in time the buffalo hunters were out there exterminating the buffalo herds. So your right to hunt would only exist as long as there were buffaloes to hunt. Article 12 is the most important thing here. Article 12 is a provision that was included in a number of treaties. Article 12 says we cannot take any more land from you unless 3/4 of the adult males agree. Okay, and that's the whole linchpin of the lone wolf case. Okay, Article 12. I'm going to go on a little bit more time than was originally on the schedule here, because there's a bit to get through with the cooperation of my other panelists. I appreciate that. But Article 12 is the most important thing. And so, this treaty was signed. It wasn't just, local news. This was in the New York Times. Okay, this is the New York Times from November 4th of 1867. And actually, this picture is sometimes referred to as ledger art. That's actually a Cheyenne artist who drew that picture at the time of the Medicine Lodge Treaty. Of course, the Cheyenne and Arapahoes also signed a treaty, which ultimately located them in the Indian Territory as well, much like the Kiowas, Comanches, and Apaches. And so this was front page headlines in New York Times. A peace treaty is signed between the United States and the Kiowas and Comanches and Apaches. And there's a reference to the speech of Setainte. Has anybody ever seen this speech? And this is one of the, I think, most eloquent things I think I've ever read, at least from looking at many, many treaties at the time. I want to share it with you. And sometimes it's written as Setanta, but that's not how you pronounce it. Setinte. Setinte means white bear. And this was his speech at the end. And you can see exactly what his sentiment was. And he said, our people, the Kiowas, once carried out a war against Texas. We thought that the president would not be offended for the Texans that had gone out from among his people and become his enemies. And that's a reference to the Confederacy. You now tell us that they have made peace and returned to the great family. The Kiowas and Comanches will seek no bloody trail in their land. They have pledged their word, and that word shall last unless the whites break their contract and invite the horrors of war. He went on to say, we do not break treaties. We make but few contracts, and them we remember well. The whites make so many that they are liable to forget them. The white chief seems not able to govern his braves. The president seems powerless in the face of his children. He sometimes becomes angry when he sees the wrongs of his people committed on the red man, and his voice becomes loud as the roaring winds. But like the wind, it soon dies away and leaves a sullen calm of unheeded oppression. We hope now that a better time has come. If all would talk and then do as you have done, the sun of peace would shine forever. We have warred against the white man, but never because it gave us pleasure. Before the day of oppression came, no white man came to our villages and went away hungry. It gave us more joy to share with them than it gave him to partake of our hospitality. In the far distant past, there was no suspicion among us. The world seemed large enough for both the red and the white man. Its broad plains now seem to contract, and the white man grows jealous of his red brother. The white man once came to trade. He now comes as a soldier. He once put his trust in our friendship and wanted no shield but our fidelity. But now he builds forts and plants big guns on their walls. He once gave us arms and powder and ball and bade us to hunt the game. We then loved him for his confidence. He now suspects our plighted path and drives us to be his enemies. He now covers his face with a cloud of jealousy and anger and tells us to be gone, as an offended master speaks to his dog. We thank the Great Spirit that all these wrongs are now to cease, and the old day of peace and friendship is to come again. You came as friends, you have talked as a friend. You have patiently heard our many complaints. To you, they may have seemed trifling. To us, they are everything. You have not tried, as many have done, to make a new bargain merely to get the advantage. You have not asked to make our annuities smaller, but unasked, you have made them larger. You have not withdrawn a single gift, but you have voluntarily provided more guarantees for our education and comfort. When we saw these things done, we then said to ourselves, or among ourselves, these are the men of the past. We at once gave you our hearts. You now have them. You know what is best for us. Do for what is best. Do for us what is best. Teach us the road to travel, and we will not depart from it forever. Your people shall again be our people, and peace shall be between us forever. If wrong comes, we shall look to you for right and justice. We know you will not forsake us. And tell your people to be as you have been. I am old, but still am chief. I shall have soon to go the way of my fathers, but those who come after me will remember this day. It is now treasured up by the old and will be carried by them to the grave and then handed down to be kept as a sacred tradition by their children and their children's children. So you can see that the power of those words. And that was essentially his farewell speech to the commissioners as they left Medicine Lodge. So we have the 1865 reservation in yellow, the 1867 reservation in red. Now, what happened after this? Of course, the tribes, Buffalo were being decimated. Tribal members were starving. This is a very bad time for a lot of the Plains tribes, particularly the Kiowas and the Comanches and Apaches. Smallpox epidemics and really starvation was one of the biggest problems. There were provisions made for food to be provided to the reservation, but since the tribes couldn't leave, Oftentimes it wasn't enough. And so a lot of times to keep alive, tribal members would, leave the reservation to go hunting for buffalo. Now, this is a kind of an unsettling picture here, but I'm going to show it to you anyway because it's the truth. That's the result of buffalo hunters going out and exterminating the buffalo. So again, once you take the food source away from the tribes, then you've really, put us at an extreme disadvantage where we have to become dependent on rations for food. And during this period of time, there were battles, skirmishes with the cavalry going on the southern plains, on the northern plains. This is a headline from the New York Times, again, 1874. Of course, that's I don't know why it's spelled Custer, but that's George Armstrong Custer, who actually fought with the Cheyennes and Arapahoes here in the Indian Territory. His demise, and then you can see all the other instances where the cavalry were attacking tribal members that were going after buffalo hunters, trying to keep them from killing all the buffalo. And that's actually a drawing from a ledger art at the bottom of a Kiowa. And you can see the battle going on between the cavalry and the mounted tribal members. Also during this time, we lost a lot of our tribal leaders. We lost a lot of our tribal members as a result of retaliation by the United States against our tribal leaders. Some were sent off to Fort Marion and other locations as prisoners of war. And that was an extremely trying time for our leaders. Okay, this is kind of what Indian Territory looked like at the time. Again, more and more tribes are being moved in. And so ultimately, the leaders that survived, including Opeatone, Wooden Lance, Kicking Bird, who was Kiowa, Pacer, who was Apache, Quanah Parker, who were Comanche, attempted to adapt to a lifestyle on the reservation, a sedentary lifestyle. Now, one of the provisions in the Medicine Lodge Treaty talked about annuities or payments being provided for 30 years. And that's an interesting thing that will come up. So these payments were going to be made for 30 years. And then after 30 years, they were, thank you, appreciate it. I'm kind of losing my voice a little bit. Keep that in mind, that 30-year provision. So during this period of time, there were 70 tribes essentially that were moved into Oklahoma over this time frame. This is ultimately what Oklahoma looked like right at the late part of 1890, 1889, right in that area. And so you saw more and more and more tribes moved into Oklahoma. During this period of time, the Kiowas joined some of the other tribes in trying to basically engage in ceremonial activities to try to bring back the way it was. That was called the ghost dance, or the Kiowas call it the feather dance. But that was shut down. The agent in Anadarko sent out probably the military and arrested 300 of our tribal members who were involved with the ghost dance. And of course, at this time, okay, I'm going to wrap up probably in about 15 minutes here. You want to break? You guys want to take a break for about 5 or 10 minutes and then pick up? I know that'll give my voice a little bit of a rest. Okay, let's take a break for about let's say about 5 minutes. How's that? Okay, sounds good. And then I think we'll pause on the Zoom. We'll be back. It looks by this clock it's 2:19. So let's pick up. Let's say 10 minutes. Let's say 2:30. How's that? Okay, thank you. Okay, we're going to go ahead and start up again. Thank you, Charlie, for that tone, that water. All right, so we've got everything up to this point in time, and then of course non-Indians are coming into the central part of the United States, and this is where things go south quickly for us. When originally the reservations were set up, there was a belief that, essentially that the central part of the United States was a wasteland. But as more and more people moved into Texas, Kansas, New Mexico, Arkansas, and looked at the Indian Territory, there was a movement represented very well by this picture of that's sometimes referred to as the best example of a visual depiction of manifest destiny, which means we have the right to take and quote unquote civilize from sea to shining sea, and anybody in the way needs to step aside. This is where it comes into the law. The Dawes Act, the Allotment Act, promoted, as you could see, for a long time in some of these treaties as an option, is now becomes mandatory. And that explains where we're at today. So Senator Dawes, a senator from Massachusetts, was basically trying to break up the tribes, break up the lands, eliminate the common ownership of tribal lands, so that all tribal members would essentially become farmers and melt into American society, and then we'd be gone. Teddy Roosevelt described it, the Allotment Act, as a pulverizing engine to break up the tribal mass. And so allotment was applied in most areas throughout the country where non-Indians wanted the land. It also aligned with some of what were called the Indian reformers, and these were former abolitionists who mainly connected with religious groups who, after the slaves were freed, went on a crusade essentially to assist other people. And they called themselves, quote unquote, the Friends of the Indians. And they were connected a lot of times with different churches, and they were promoting allotment to break up the tribes, to eliminate communal ownership. This is a quote from Dio, and this is the Dio from Dio Mission, just near between Cache and Indiahoma, where the churches were actively promoting allotment and breaking up the tribes and eliminating tribal ceremonies and other things. And they were some of the biggest proponents to the Congress, saying this is what we need to do to these tribal members. Another one, J.J. Methven, was a missionary and was essentially promoting allotment as well, and trying to eradicate traditional tribal religious beliefs, including Native American church and some of the dances such as the sun dance and other ceremonies that they viewed as non-Christian. And then a lot of, not just some of those groups, other groups also urged and promoted allotment to legislators, saying that we would not, we could not do anything other than break up the tribes and literally break up the tribal ownership of lands. This is has anybody ever seen this mural at the state capitol? This is a mural. It's pretty interesting if you look at it. And this is, and I know we're here at the University of Oklahoma, and I hear people say boomer sooner all the time. Who were the boomers? Well, the boomers were the ones that wanted to take our land. That's what they were. The boomers were the ones that were promoting taking Indian land. And so then if you look at this mural, there's a lot going on here. Of course, there's a railroad engine pulling railroad cars of non-Indians. They're sitting on top. This is a representation of the opening of what was called the unassigned lands. And I remembered former dean of or president of OCU University, Robert Henry, said, how can you call them unassigned lands? They've been assigned to every other tribe over and over and over again. They were unassigned at that moment, but they were assigned multiple times to many different tribes. But this is a representation of the opening of the unassigned lands, which is basically where we stand here up to Guthrie. That was previously part of the Seminole and Creek Nations, but and they had plans to move other tribes here to Oklahoma. There were plans to move the Pueblos here. There were plans to move the Navajos here, all the other tribes to the Indian Territory. So if you look at that, you can see a graphic representation of this allotment process being presented to tribes. And then you see this just, stunning representation of justification to take land, which says go forth to possess the promised land. Well, who was the land promised to, folks? I mean, the land was promised to the tribes. It wasn't promised to people coming in to take it. So again, the Sooners were the ones that, as everybody knows, took during the land runs, took their claims sooner than they were supposed to. So essentially, not only were they taking Indian land, but they were breaking the law at the same time. And actually, the term Sooner was a terrible slur until they renamed the University of Oklahoma's football team Sooners, and then it became not such a bad word. So again, there was promotion of taking of Indian lands. Oklahoma, the Indian Territory, was split in half. The western half became Oklahoma Territory, and the eastern half, because of the power of the 5 tribes, resisted and were able to hang on to their tribal ownership. Meanwhile, allotment was brought to most of the tribes on the western side of the state, and ultimately to the eastern side of the state as well. Another thing that happened in the KCA area was promotion of gold rushes. There were rushes of people coming into the KCA area. There was some belief that there was gold in the Wichita Mountains. And so there were lots of non-Indians coming in, encroaching, trespassing on the reservation in search of gold. There was a police force established at Anadarko. Those were some of the Indian police at the time. Quanah Parker was a judge of the very first CFR court, the Court of Indian Offenses, which was established in the late 1890s. Black Goose, also the Kiowa is Charles Kongya. He was my great-great-grandfather, and he was one of the first judges of the CFR court of the Court of Indian Offenses. And so they were overwhelmed trying to keep out all the non-Indians. So this was the tactic used not just here in the KCA area, but elsewhere to try to promote allotment. Basically, commissioners were sent out. They pressured and argued with tribal leaders to agree to allotment, and if they didn't agree, then there were all kinds of tactics used to try to split the tribe in half, get the progressive members of the tribe to agree to it. It caused dissension within the tribe. Try to eliminate people that were leasing Indian land, like cattlemen, get them out of the way, because the tribes were actually making a lot of money leasing out their reservation property to Texas cattlemen, as the KCA did, and getting income that way. So we got to get these, and what actually happened, they suspended leasing so that the cattlemen could no longer exert an influence, and to cut off money that was coming to the tribes. And this was the mentality of allotments, that the reservations need to be broken up. We need to do away with the tribes because we need to have non-Indians come in and have more farms. The Jerome Commission is who was designated by the United States to travel throughout western Oklahoma, including the Kiowas and Comanches, the Cheyennes and Arapahoes, the Wichitas, Caddos, and Delawares, to try to negotiate another quote-unquote treaty. Treaty making was ended in 1871, so we could not make any treaties anymore. David Jerome and some other commissioners went out to the western frontier, came to our reservation, and were tasked with the proposition of trying to get us to adopt or agree with allotment. And why? Because we need to be farmers. The reservation was a failure. That if we didn't agree to allotment, then it would be imposed on us anyway, and we would be worse off. The Cheyenne and Arapahoes were one of the first Western tribes to be have their reservation allotted or divided up. And the Kiowas learned very quickly that the Cheyenne Arapahoes were a lot worse off afterwards, after the reservation was opened up to non-Indian settlement. So in September of 1892, they sent out this commission to meet with the Kiowas, Comanches, and Apaches to try to take the reservation and open it to non-Indian settlement. There was a belief, and it's very interesting if you look at the documents, and the documents are in our materials, there was this belief that somehow the Medicine Lodge Treaty would expire because the annuities would expire. If you read through what the tribal leaders are saying, and the commissioners kind of took advantage of that. And because the Medicine Lodge Treaty was signed in 1867, so in 1897, the annuities for 30 years would stop. Well, among the tribal members, there was the promotion of this idea that the treaty would stop, and that was not the case. That was absolutely not the case. It was just the payments would stop. But the commissioners kind of took that idea and ran with it, saying, you got to do this because your treaty is going to expire. They met with the Comanches and the Kiowas in different locations. One of the biggest opponents to the treaty was descendants of the chief Dohassan, and said, you know, I don't want to give my country to the whites. Some of the older warriors were still around from Medicine Lodge Treaty days, and they brought the treaty to the first meeting and said, you know, no, we don't need this. We have this treaty. Respect it. There was a Comanche that did that. His name was Gap in the Woods. Oh, yeah. So when the commission first started talking to the tribes, they said, oh, you know, we're going to give you something really good here. You're going to have a home that will be yours forever. It won't ever be taken away. They didn't have any secret ulterior motives. Well, of course, that's false. He went over the threat that if you don't sign this agreement, then you're going to be allotted anyway, and you're going to come out with a short end of the stick. You're going to have even less acreage. They said that they didn't want anything from the tribes. Of course, that was a lie. And again, threatened the tribal members with allotment if they didn't sign an agreement to open up the reservation. Now, you start looking at the numbers, and I didn't ever really realize the numbers, but of course, most tribal members knew that we were leasing out a lot of the reservation to Texas ranchers. And so we were getting lots of payments, what was referred to sometimes as grass money. And if you look at the Kiowa calendars, you can see little coins, and that's the grass money. So the Jerome Commission was saying, well, you know, if you open up your reservation, then and we pay you for what's not assigned to a tribal member. In other words, the unallotted land, the open land that would remain after an allotment was made, then that would be really financially beneficial to you. And then we would essentially put aside $2 million, and we would generate income that would come to about $25 a person. Well, by this time, and in 1899, the tribes were already making way more than that. They were making $75 a person just by leasing it, you know, every year to the Texas cattlemen. So to say that signing this agreement would benefit you financially was, you know, absolutely wrong and a lie. Okay, so the biggest obstacle that the commissioner saw was this Article 12 provision of the treaty, where we need 3/4 of the adult males. Remember that? So their task was to get 3/4 of the adult males to agree with us, because at this point in time, there was the belief that they had to comply with the treaty, and if they didn't comply with the treaty, then that would be a violation of the treaty, and of course that would be problematic. So it became a numbers game. So they added a lot of non-Indians to get allotments, some of whom were married to tribal members, to try to get the tribal members on the side of opening up the reservation. After a while, out of the quote unquote 450 names that would be required, and that was based on false numbers of how many Indians there were, By October 7th, they had 193, and after another week, they had 342 signatures. The agent at the time gave a lower number of total Indians at the time, obviously in order to skew the figures. So what was the tribe's response to that? Stumbling Bear basically said, no, we don't want to sell our country. Lone Wolf the Younger, who was actually Old Chief Lone Wolf's nephew, whose original name was Mamade, was one of the biggest opponents to the allotment. He said it would be a sudden downfall for the tribes. He was against it. Quanah Parker was against it. And he kept asking about if you're going to do this, how much are we going to get per acre? Because other tribes had gotten a certain amount, and they, played games with coming up with an actual figure per acre that the tribes could figure out how much, if this allotment went through as they proposed, how much they would get. Again, the story ICO, who was a scout, and there was what was called Troop L. Troop L were Indian scouts. They were stationed at Fort Sill. There was a lot of Kiowas and Comanches who were in the army as scouts. But they heard from the Cheyennes how bad it was. Kiowa leader Comanche said basically, there's no way that you can live on 160 acres in this area. It's not possible. And have a farm or have livestock. Wooden Lance or Oputone is the biggest opponent. And he basically, at a meeting in Anadarko, what was mostly Kiowas, basically asked the crowd, do you want to stay on the Medicine Lodge Road, or do you want to go with this allotment? And everyone stood up, in his support. No, we want to stay on the Medicine Lodge Road. We don't want to open up this reservation to non-Indians. So what happened? Ultimately, the tribes figured out that there were all kinds of deceitful things going on, falsehoods. There was so much opposition with the Kiowas, primarily when they came to Anadarko. It was realized that they were being scammed. The primary problem was one of the Kiowa interpreters named Joshua Gibbons. He was charged by tribal members as mistranslating, as lying, and not stating what the actual translations were. Of course, very few Kiowas could speak English, and so the commissioners are speaking in English. They're presenting English documents and writing, and the interpreter was somebody whose wife was going to get an allotment, was probably biased, was absolutely biased, and accused by various tribal members of mistranslating. And there's actual documentation from a book. There's a very good book by the late Blue Clark, who was at OCU, that documents this, that Joshua Gibbons was not only mistranslating, he was forging other people's marks or signatures on this agreement, particularly some of the soldiers, and also was ordering people to sign this agreement, basically under threat of because he was their supervisor, he had other people do it. Some refused to sign, and then he just put their name down anyway. So who was this Joshua Gibbons? Joshua Gibbons was educated at Carlisle, which was, of course, a military style school. He was a Presbyterian missionary. He was a principal of the Indian school. But this is an excerpt from something that he wrote. Basically, he was a proponent of giving up the tribal lifestyle and basically assimilating. So that explains some of that. Big Tree was the other primary opponent, and said that Gibbons was mistranslating. He was forging signatures. The tribes demanded additional translators to discuss and translate during the negotiations. In Blue Clark's book, there's a reference to Sam Quitone. I actually think, because that's my family, I think it was actually Sam Autone, who was a brother of Jimmy Quitone, because I don't know of any Sam Quitone, but if somebody does, let me know. but he was brought in to translate, and he was the one that warned the tribes, you know, Joshua Gibbons is mistranslating. He's not giving the proper translation. And then there's a quote from Big Tree where he basically says here, and you can read it in detail, but the commissioners were not letting the tribal members speak. They weren't letting the Indians speak. The people that were opposed to it, they wouldn't let them talk. And so they made them wait and wait and wait, hoping that they would leave, I assume. So once they found out about the mistranslating, Lone Wolf, Big Tree, Comanches, others said, take our name off the document. We don't count us. We want to withdraw our signatures. That was not allowed. The agent wouldn't allow it. It ultimately ended up in essentially a shouting match where Apiatone accused the commissioner of deceit and being dishonest. And the Jerome commissioner, David Jerome, got mad and said, okay, we're leaving. We're gone. We're leaving the reservation. Now, they thought that they had enough signatures, and plus they wouldn't allow people to take them off. And so they just left. So they go back to Washington. And then what happens? Well, then there's a big push to try to ratify this quote unquote agreement or treaty. Between 1892 and 1900, there were delegations of Kiowas and Comanches that went to Washington over and over and over again to try to keep the Congress from passing this agreement or allotting the reservation. And you can see some of there's a picture there of Lone Wolf, Quanah Parker. They went there over and over again. The military, even on the side of the tribes, said basically they were tricked into signing away their lands. The population of the reservation is in ferment. That there was fraud, misrepresentation, all of these things. So once it got back to Washington, of course, Texas representatives, Oklahoma, Kansas, they all started trying to get our reservation allotted. They wanted to put the Jerome Agreement into effect. The Indian Rights Association approached the tribe, and they were basically representing tribal members in different challenges, and asked that a lawsuit be filed, and came to the rescue of the Kiowas and Comanches and Apaches to try to stop the allotment, and assisted them in lobbying Congress to keep it from being put into effect. There are actual letters here, and those are in the materials, basically saying, the tribes are making a lot more money from the leasing of these lands to Texas ranchers, and they were doing just fine, and they're going to lose in this deal. Not only that, there was fraud that was employed. So ultimately, where did the numbers come out? Well, once you figure out that the first agent, Agent Day, had said there were fewer Indians, they would have had 3/4. But there was a request made, and they did an actual count. And so if you counted up 21 and above, they did not have enough signatures. If you counted 18 and above, they still did not have enough signatures. So that provision of the treaty was not complied with, even with all the fraud and everything else. Well, unfortunately, in 1900, Congress went ahead and passed the Allotment Act anyway. Not only did they pass it in violation of the treaty, they passed it entirely different version of what the tribes had agreed to. And so then there was a lot of promotion from railroads and others to try to get into the lands. El Reno was overrun with people just trying to line up to come in, and because the land runs were so chaotic, they decided instead to have a land lottery instead of having land runs. This is where Lone Wolf filed the lawsuit with the help of the Indian Rights Association and others, and that's a picture of Lone Wolf. So it was kind of a race to the courthouse. They were still trying to get the reservation opened on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the tribes were trying to stop it. They got injunctions and other means of trying to stop the allotment, and once, of course, people stake their claims, it'd be very hard to undo all that. So there were a lot of non-Indians lining up. Unfortunately, the tribe obviously was unable to stop the allotment. The allotment went through anyway. The president proclaimed the reservation open, and so the reservation went from the large contiguous land to what it looks like there. The red squares are the allotments that were made. They kept them small at 160 acres. There were some forest reserves and an area called the Big Pasture, which was on the southern edge of the reservation. Ultimately, those were open to allotment as well. So that's kind of what it looked like. You can see that mostly they were selected along the rivers. And that's important now because most of our allotments that remain today are along these rivers. This is a picture of the lottery boxes down in Lawton where people threw in their names. There were 165,000 people that put their names in to try to get one of the 13,000 areas of non-Indian homesteads. And so actually after the allotment took place, there were 3 counties established: Kiowa, Caddo, and Comanche. So this is why we have, this is what our tribal trust lands look like today that are still in trust. That's why they're all checkerboarded like that. Okay, so here's a chronology. I'm not going to go through all of this, but essentially multiple different venues were sought, injunctions were in place and then set aside, and ultimately it ended up at the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court heard the case. Lone Wolf, the chief, sued Ethan Hitchcock, and Ethan Hitchcock was the Secretary of Interior. Basically, the arguments were that the fraud and the false translations that took place, that the treaty was violated, that there wasn't the 3/4 as required, that it was a taking in violation of the Constitution, taking property without just compensation, and that the agreement that the tribe signed, even if you accept that, was something totally different than what Congress passed. So they passed something that wasn't approved by anyone. So what happened? January 5th, 1903, and this is considered to be what's called the Dred Scott decision of Indian law, which of course the Dred Scott decision was a very bad case. It came out not too far in time from this. So the court came out against the tribes unanimously and basically said we can abrogate, terminate, ignore a treaty whenever we want to. We don't have to abide by a treaty. And if Congress decided to violate the treaty, that was their right, that they could do it. And you can't go to the courts to stop it. And this is the source of what's called the plenary power doctrine, which basically means Congress has absolute power over Indian affairs. And if you go to courts to get compensation or get relief, we're going to look the other way. And notwithstanding all of the pleadings and all the evidence of fraud and deceit, the court said we have to presume that Congress acted in perfect good faith in dealing with the Indians. So that was not good at all. And you contrast that with this quote from our chief, and you can judge yourself whether or not his request was honored. All right, we're going to go ahead and conclude and switch over to our next speaker. And I appreciate the additional time to get through all these very detailed facts. We will be taking questions. If you have a question, we're going to ask you to write it down on some cards there and then provide it to one of our presenters, and then we'll take those up at the end. If you have any questions and you're online on Zoom, you can type those in the chat box and we'll be checking on those in the meantime. So I'm going to turn it over to Kirk Kickingbird, who is a very well distinguished attorney, longtime practicer in Indian law matters. And he's going to take us up after allotment in the next time frame up until the Little Chief case.
I see that Arvo has left me 5 minutes for my presentation, having eaten into my time. What we're looking at next is the aftermath of allotment. We'll be moving through this fairly quickly. we have among our materials a law review article called Way Down Yonder in the Indian Nations. And that takes up most of some of the legal issues relating from allotment jurisdiction arising out of the allotment process up to about Stock and Fox versus Lewis in 1993. So I started out at this law school, not this law school, the real law school down the North Oval, Monette Hall. And I was contacted by NCIA about a treaty project. And the treaty project idea was to review 400 treaties and agreements between Indians and the U.S. Indian nations and tribes and assess whether those treaties could be used to assert tribal government rights and powers today, and explore how treaties could be used to protect tribal interests today. And that is really the crux of our problem with the outcome in the Lone Wolf case. So Vine was, Deloria Jr. had been executive director of NCI, help fight termination to a standstill, decided he needed to go to law school. He found it was his belief after his experience in Washington that nobody listened to lobbyists unless they were lawyers. And he and John Belinda were going to switch places. After he finished law school, John was supposed to go to law school. And it was an early attempt to start a legal organization addressed to Indian legal issues and Indian rights. So they asked me to start the project at the end of my second year of law school, May of 1968. Spent the summer, at that time, no Indian law course was here or in any law school. We had Professor Eric's Indian land titles course, but that was focused on land and real property issues more than it was on Indian law. So I ended up in the attic of old Monette Hall, which now houses the Western History Collection. Ran into Professor Merrill. Maurice Merrill was a constitutional law professor, and he gave me guidance around where the relevant books, because he was aware of them, Cohen, Kepler's Law and Treaties, and showed me where they were. And so I spent that summer reading Kepler and Cohen. It was just plodding and tedious, no eureka moments. Sent periodic reports back to NCAI. Project ended with the summer. Vine was finishing that book, Custer Died for Your Sins, finishing law school. John Belinda didn't get elected in NCAI for a second term. So NCAI leadership didn't pursue the treaty project, and that's kind of where it stood. So I got hired to go to Washington and worked in the Congressional Relations Office of BIA. And backup legislation is what I did. And then Nixon issued his Indian policy statement. And I spent probably over a course of 6 months, along with a guy named Frank Ducheneau, taking that legislative package around the country to explain it to tribal leaders. The policy, everything became law except a separate Indian Trust Council, independent of the Solicitor's Office at Interior or independent of the Department of Justice to represent Indian interests. And as we've seen from that history of the adoption of approval of the ratification of the Jerome Agreement, Indians sure could have used that in a whole variety of ways. So dissatisfied with the BIA, I started work for the Institute for the Development of Indian Law. Vine Deloria, Frank Ducheneau, and I founded this organization. And part of the idea was to look at those treaty issues that we started several years earlier. But the first book was 100 million acres, and it was to get Indian issues out in front of people. Because the Custer book had gotten a lot of success, a lot of attention. My co-author, Karen Ducheneau, and I put the book together, and with the idea that there should be a minimum of Indian land base of 100 million acres. At that time, there were about 52 million acres. I think we're up to about 56 million now. Does anybody call a figure? So there was the book. And I'm going to skip Marble Lane. I'm going to skip Harjo for the moment because of time. Ended up at the American Indian Policy Review Commission. Now, there had been a siege of Wounded Knee, and the takeover of the Bureau of Indian Affairs building in Washington, D.C. This is November 72, spring of 73. A lot of times, both at the takeover in DC and at Wounded Knee, people have been quoting certain things about treaties. And sometimes they were taking sections out of treaties, other tribes' treaties, and applying them universally to all tribes. So some of the rights and some of the advantages that they promoted or proposed really didn't apply universally. And so we found a need to get out what the treaties were. And our treaty project began at IDIL with a book like this on Indian treaties. Take it out so people can see what's really in it. Indian jurisdiction, which we're looking at today, a continuing and ongoing problem. First book was actually a book called Indian Sovereignty, which I didn't have a copy and didn't bring. But to look about the authority and powers of your government, because one of the things, in addition to this domestic dependent nations phrase, as those early Cherokee cases, and Worcester case said, tribes are distinct, independent political communities. And that's what we were looking at, and that's the idea we had focused on in our work. So this congressional commission was supposed to look at what had caused those problems and try to avoid repeating them. We ended up with a 2-year study, 8,000 pages, 14 published volumes. It set the foundation for Indian policy when the report came out in 77 up to the present day. Partly because of the work and the research, but partly also because of the staff. They went to work for other congressional offices. After the report came out, they went to work for other federal agencies. And this was the time when the Indian desks were growing, and they could bring both knowledge and sensitivity and be able to quote what the law said and what Congress had approved as what Indian policy should be. So those are the APEC reports. That's how the staff helped improve Indian law and policy. And one of the things we found, you need, as I said, sometimes tribes or tribal leaders, members of AIM, other activists, quoting parts of treaties that really didn't apply in the situation they were applying them to. So that's why we say, look carefully at the treaties, do solid work. Standard resources, as you know, are the Handbook of Federal Indian Law, and I always recommend the 42 edition because there's an attitude that it carries and tells you about that Cohen brought to that work. And also you find it in his book, a compilation of his works called The Legal Conscience. And particularly that section, Indians' Quest for Justice. So take a look at those items when you begin your research, begin your study of Indian law. The original went to 1938. Volume 2 has the treaties out of 5 volumes. In 1968, when the Indian Civil Rights Act was passed, it was Congress directed to be brought up to date. And so it now is, publication was done in 75, has 7 volumes. That's Capital Laws and Treaties, original 5, with new 2. You can see they're a little more bright, the gold on them. So, in 1855, as Arvo told you, Indian tribal boundaries in Oklahoma looked like this. A treaty with the Chickasaw and Choctaw in that year established the least district, and the function was to settle other tribes in that area. Here's an 1882 Commissioner of Indian Affairs report, and a map appeared in it. Note that by this time, over in the least district, we've got the Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache. The punishment of treaties after the Civil War, 1866, the 5 tribes had their western Oklahoma lands curtailed. Cheyenne Arapaho were out there. But if you look carefully, you'll see that area, and Arvo pointed this out, the unassigned lands are actually reserved for Indians. So that, as Arvo pointed out, there are not any unassigned lands. These are always, or should have been held for tribal population. including the use of those tribes who were already here, not any new tribes that might have been brought in, Pueblos, Navajos, or whoever. So the General Allotment Act was the mighty pulverizing engine that broke up the reservations. So between 1887 and 1934, the Indians lost 90 million acres of land. And it was to move back towards that amount of the 134 million acres. That was what our book, 100 Million Acres, was about. So in 1887, the commissioner's annual report said the lands held by Indians and tribes in Indian Territory, and this doesn't include the Panhandle, the land was 41 million acres, 64,000 square miles. The lands held by the Kiowa and Comanche in the Medicine Lodge Treaty area was 2,968,000 acres, 4,600 square miles. The lands in present-day Oklahoma consist of 44 million acres. So that includes that panhandle area. So this is what it looked like in 1889. Process of the Jerome Committee, originally named the Commission of the Five Civilized Tribes. David Jerome became commissioner, and it became known as the Jerome Commission. They'd already done their forced allotment, or working on forced allotment on the east side of the state. And they then began to work on the west side, starting with the Cheyenne Arapahoes. So, negotiations began in 1892, as several pointed out. Required signatures were reported to have been obtained in October of 1892, and then it took until June 6, 1900, before Congress approved that or ratified that agreement. And that any allotment was delayed till 1903. So, beginning in 1870, and from 1872 to 1900, the year of the Jerome Agreement ratification, Congress had funded reservations in western Oklahoma. Then in Appropriation Acts from 1900 to 1925, Congress continued to fund reservations in western Oklahoma. Now here's the language that they used. For subsistence and civilization of the Arapahoes, Cheyennes, Apaches, Kiowas, Comanches, and Wichitas who had been collected upon the reservations set apart for their use and occupation. So Congress refers to these reservations before and after allotment. And so there is clearly an argument that these reservations continued, though allotted and opened to non-Indian settlement. In the Oklahoma Enabling Act, there was a pledge to leave tribal issues and lands in the hands of the federal government. In 1906, this report came from the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Tribes had ceded, KC had ceded 2,400,000 acres. Says 443,000 acres had been allotted to 2,759 Indians. 11,000 were reserved for the agency, school, and religious purposes, and then 2 million open to settlement. Despite this initial allotment, the big pasture and those wood reserves had not yet been opened. Congress would authorize those, and there would be a further allotment to tribal members, those who had not been born at the time of the 1903 allotment. Then the Oklahoma Constitution continues that pledge that Indian lands and Indian issues remain under the control of the United States. Note here, in 1932, an executive order extended the trust period on the KCA reservation. Extension of trust period on Indian reservation allotments, and it names off the reservations, and down there is Kiowa Reservation, Oklahoma, signed by Herbert Hoover. So this seems consistent with the treatment of Congress to call these areas reservations. In 1932, there was a sale of the KCA Cemetery Reserve. It was being used by both Indians and non-Indians. And so the decision was made to urge the tribes to sell a portion of that cemetery to non-Indians for the burial of their relatives. And here it says, the sale can be done, provided no patent shall issue until the cemetery association has been legally organized to hold title, and until payment for the area involved has been made to the superintendent of the reservation. That's an existing reservation in an amount not less than the appraised value. And they reserve the oil and gas rights to the tribes. Now here's the administration of the Wichita Reservation and the Kiowa Reservation have been consolidated back in the 1870s. And so here appears a map of that area, the Wichita, Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache Reservation, Wichita being above the Ouachita there. Now, I'll go past this for a second. The legend of that map indicates it's from the Department of the Interior, drawn by the U.S. Geological Survey, drawn by a fellow named George Bystrom. It was approved on October 14th, 1933. And it's hard to read. The small ones are there. Let me put it on this one. It was revised in 1936, 1959, 61, 62, 64, 65, 67, 68, 69, 70, 72, 73, 76, 78, and 1985. So this is what the Department of Interior says is the KCA reservation between 1933 and 1985. Look at those multiple revisions. It's hard to see how they made a mistake in calling this area a reservation. All right, let's drop back. A case popped up on the east side of the state, ex parte Nawabi. It concluded that because of all the special legislation, the Curtis Act and other legislation, the Five Tribes Act, directed the five tribes to force them to agree to allotment, that none of the areas, including trust or restricted allotments on the east side of the state, continued as Indian country. And they're subject to the authority to prosecute a homicide of an Indian by an Indian on a restricted allotment. They said that was not Indian country. This is from the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals. So in 1946, Congress added lands to the KCA reservation. Rainy Mountain School Reserve was no longer needed for the administrative purposes. This had been held by the government, not by the tribes. And so Congress directed that title is hereby vested in the United States in trust for the Indians of the Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache Indian Reservation. So there's this continuing treatment, not only in the Appropriation Acts up till 1925, but certainly after the war and some of that language of the executive order by Herbert Hoover in the 1930s, that there is a KCA reservation. In 1946, the Department of Interior made a reservation land return. In December of that year, they described certain lands and said they are added to, it will be in the public interest, and said lands are hereby restored to tribal ownership for the use and benefit of the Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache tribe, and are added to and made a part of the existing Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache reservation, subject to any valid existing rights. So they're saying that's an existing reservation. All right, so in 1948, 2 years later, we asked to have Congress approving another KCA reservation land sale. This time it's to Comanche County for a hospital. And monies from the sale of this land to the county are to be placed in the treasury to the credit of the tribal fund of the Indians of the Comanche, Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache Reservation. Now, this is the continuing treatment from Medicine Lodge treaty times to the present that that area is a reservation. But pops up in 1950, the Tuska case. And this is an Apache who have committed homicide, a Comanche woman on an allotment. And the 10th Circuit determined, gosh, all this allotment stuff, there's no longer a reservation there. That's not Indian country. Even though the murder was occurred on a trust allotment. The next thing I wanted to highlight was the Doomsday Report. That sounds a little sinister. It's because it is. It was about a predicate study before termination. So when William the Conqueror invaded England in 1066, he wanted to know what he owned. So he sent out this big survey of people, animals, crops, forests, economic resources, pigs, cattle, trees. And it was said to be the kind of information that St. Peter would want you at the pearly gates on Judgment Day to decide whether you go into heaven or you go to hell. So it's a Judgment Day kind of report, both in the sense for William the Conqueror and for the purposes of this committee of Congress who authorized the report. So it was 1,500 pages in length. Got the citation there, and that should be in your materials. That's what it looked like. Frank Ducheneau, who I worked with in congressional relations in BIA in 1969 and 70, went out in the hall and he saw they were throwing out a lot of old books. And he practically fell over into and it was one of those canvas crash carts, and came up with 2 copies of this. He said, "Here, hold on to this. This is valuable. You're really going to need this someday." And I am. I've been using it. So the most economically successful tribes are targeted for termination. And it was made official policy the year after this report in House Concurrent Resolution 108, which you may have heard of. But it has a notation on page 109 as part of Table 12, the data on reservation law and order. And that little footnote says this: state handles all law and order problems and finances the same on a county basis. State jurisdiction exercised on Osage Reservation and all reservations under the Southern Plains Agency is subject to court attack due to absence of congressional authority. That's kind of reverse approval of that reservation status from these other legislative acts and executive orders and Department of Interior Federal Register notices. There's a chart on pages 1090 and 1091 of that report, and it shows that all tribes under the agency designated as having a reservation with an R beside their name. The report also gives the historical and legal history of all the Oklahoma tribes and refers to the land base as a reservation. Although it does say for the east side of the state and the 5 tribes, they have land areas. So here's what the Doomsday Report said about KCA lands in 1951. This is the latest data in which data was collected. They talked about originally allotted of 702,000 acres. And I'm not quite clear on what that is because they have the similar trust status, 477,000 acres. And they have fee status, and that's not clear to me who owns the fee status, whether it's a tribal member or whether it's a non-Indian. Tribal ownership was 3,400 acres. That was a chart on page 1236. The next page, 1237, says this: 34,500 allotments made. That's up from that 2,700 I think we saw earlier in 1903. Acreage allotted is 542,000, which is bigger than the 477 above. And so the reason for the difference in the figures is unclear, but there are approximately, certainly the allotments to tribal members is a similar figure. In 1966, there's a reservation land return, another notice by DOI, Department of Interior, in the Federal Register. And it states that certain names lands that have been held for the BIA administrative purposes are now surplus, and they're hereby restored to tribal ownership for the use and benefit of the Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache tribes of Indians, and are added to and made a part of the existing reservation, subject to any valid existing rights. So you've got the continuing reference to an existing reservation. In 1967, the next year, Department of Interior gives another Federal Register notice. More surplus land that had been used by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and they are hereby restored to tribal ownership for the use and benefit of the Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache tribes of Indians, and are added to and made a part of the existing reservation. So, as this final report, and I've got the wrong date there, the final report is 1977. As this final report is put together, it commented and did some research on Oklahoma, and here's what it had to say about Oklahoma. 2 places in the final report. It has long been assumed unequivocally by both federal and state authorities that the initial reservation boundaries no longer exist for jurisdictional purposes as a result of the allotment process. That's the outcome we saw in both Nawabi and Tuska. As a corollary misconception, it has been assumed the Indian tribes within possess few, if any, residual powers of self-government. And then at 120, it says, there is a definite need to clarify jurisdictional relationships of the tribes, which includes a clear recognition that Oklahoma tribes do enjoy reservation status. Now, we've seen that play out in the McGirt case, and we see various defendants trying to assert that on the west side of the state. Here's the latest figures that I was able to find, 2019, KCA, it's 266,000 acres in trust. Restricted land is 8,000 acres. Fee is 24,000 acres. And once again, there was not enough substance in the report to tell me what those last two were. This is a map put together by the agency promoted oil and gas leases and the lands available in the KCA reservation. And this is for the Summer North American Petroleum Exposition 2020. And it's pretty much accords with the earlier maps that pattern that Arvo had shown you. Okay, so most of you have access to electronic legal research providers. OU has a bunch of materials. You also have the internet, Google Books, Oklahoma History Center. So this is where you find Congressional Serial Set, which are the documents of the Congress considers, committee reports and various things, part of which Arvo has placed in the Dropbox for you to see for this event. So you can, sometimes it takes a little work to be able to narrow down the materials, but you can get them there. Documents before 1817 are found in the American State Papers, and it's largely not things that we're looking for in Oklahoma. Here's OU's Digital Commons, where there are Alaskan, American Indian, Alaska Native documents. Okay, this is also in material. So you don't have to be scrambling to get it. It's the Library of Congress. You find the statutes of the large. It's an easy way to get there. This is the Doomsday Report. It's online. You can go directly to it. Or you have and here's the Kapplers. You can go directly to them as well. Or you can download them. Problem is you get everybody's treaty, some 420 or something, treaties and agreements, maybe more than you want. So that brings me to a conclusion of my segment. And we're just about an hour on after our last break. So let's take about 10 minutes and we'll continue with our concluding segments.
For those of you online who are getting credit, the first two words are, I'm going to mention different chiefs, Big Tree and Pacer. Big Tree and Pacer, and we'll give you two more words for the second, after the next two presenters. Again, if you are wanting CLE credit, if you're an attorney, you have to have paid your fee and then send us a email to Oklahoma Indian Bar Association at yahoo.com within 1 hour of the conclusion of this segment, which is going to be at least by 6 o'clock. You must put your bar number and your name as the bar has it. Otherwise, we won't be able to give you credit. If you're an attorney and want credit here, please come forward now and we will have you sign in. If you haven't, you have to have you sign in at the beginning and sign in at the end. Thank you. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started again. I'd like to introduce Rylan Rivas Sr. Rylan is practicing attorney. He's located in Chickasha, and he is Comanche. And some of you may know his son, Rylan Jr., who's also here, right there. And he's been a prosecutor and a practicing attorney in the Court of Indian Offenses for many, many years. And I was in college and I tried to do my major in what was called policy studies. And I didn't even know what policy studies was, but I switched to government. And my first experience with the law was in front of the Honorable Rylan Rivas, who was a judge. I was 24 years old, and I was working in the Court of Indian Offenses for the Anadarko agency, which was the first modern day tribal court that was reestablished. And he's going to tell you a little bit about how that came to pass back I was there in 1981. And I think you probably were there before that. So Rylan Rivas Sr. was going to bring us up from the period of time that Kirk left off until, including the Little Chief case, until around 2010. Thank you.
Thank you. We've had a lot of academics come up and speak. They're very good, and I wanted to tell you how much I appreciate them. A couple of things just to go back to what they said. 160 acres in western Oklahoma is impossible to make a living off of. Those people were right, and so were the tribal leaders. I've got a small farm out in Tillman County, and if I tried to live off that, you'd have to come out and get me out of the dust because it is so hard to make a living. Another thing is that one of the tribal leaders, when we all came into Fort Sill and gave up, in my particular case, my great-great-grandfather was named Tabananica. He came in with his band of about 149 people. It was all that was left. And after he came in and gave up, well, he got a surprise too. He got sent to Florida as a prisoner of war for 14 years. So you're looking at a guy whose ancestors were prisoners of war in the United States of America. And so when I was brought up, one other thing. Harvo here, he kind of calls us senior lawyers now. Well, we didn't used to be senior. We were so young. Kurt Kickingbird in 1969 Jack McCarty about the same time, and Browning Pipestem. They were the three Indian lawyers that I knew of, and they were the only ones. I was really fortunate that to come along when I did. And who would have ever thought that we would be happy to with Richard Nixon? But Richard Nixon made a huge difference for Indians. Self-determination was the beginning of everything. One of the, I want to refer to just one thing that I read quite often to remind me that how things are, and it's contained in Ecclesiastes. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all of your might. I encourage you all to do that. Another thing that's become pretty obvious to me, and this is said, the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor the bread to the wise, nor riches to men of understanding, nor favor to men of skill, but time and chance happen to them all. Because time and chance does happen to all of us. We can't plan everything. So how did we get here? Well, you will recall, and during 1969, in that period of time, the Vietnam War was going on. Tribal leaders needed lawyers. We only had 3 that we knew of. My tribal leaders at the time were James Cox, who was Quanah Parker's grandson, Lee Motah, Joe Atokney, Haddon Noni, and George Wallace. Them, along with a friend of my father's named Dr. Everett Rhodes, a Kiowa man, who we hunted with in the spring and in the fall on May Johnson's place north of Lake Watonka. They all were instrumental in what happened to me in my life by chance. Because of them, they needed a lawyer. I was coming out of college. I thought I was going to Vietnam. They had a different idea. I got lucky. They said, we need a lawyer. We want you to go to law school. Well, I didn't have any money. I was broke. I was married, had a little boy, about 2 years old. Dr. Rhodes, though, was head of the American Indian Scholarships out of Albuquerque, New Mexico. And with $125 a month and a chance to go to the Summer Indian Law Program in Albuquerque, there we went. During law school, there were 9 of us that were identified as American Indians in that law school class in 1971. 8 of us finished and got our degrees and passed the bar exam. There were just a few of us that stayed around to do Indian law because, as Kirk said, and Marvo knows, back then there was no Indian law in Oklahoma. Joe Rarick's class on Indian land titles was all there was, and we all took it. You know, Joe Rarick, who would ever forget that man? He was quite the guy. So law school rocked on. I finished law school, took the bar exam in February of 1974. After passing the bar that February, Browning Pipestem and I started a law firm, along with another fellow who was a Wyandotte guy that went to law school with me, with me at that time, John Charlo. So it was Pipestem, Rivas, and Charlo. With $300 that we borrowed on my car, we started an office at the Security Bank on the 3rd floor in Norman, Oklahoma. Tribes had no money. Tribes at that time lived on grants. They were trying to figure out housing. They were just simply existing. We were living with Tewisca. And when I got out of law school and we started this law firm, Browning Pipestem was fired up and instrumental, along with me and John and a few of us, to get something done. But it took time and chance. We In 1975, we heard about Mr. Little Chief. And I'm not sure how we heard about it, but Indian country is very small, especially even then, it was particularly small. And we knew that we had a case. We could see it. Good facts make good law, bad facts make bad law. This was a case where there was good facts. This was an Indian boy. He had committed a manslaughter case on trust property against another Indian, his father. And they had filed on him in state court. In those days, if you were indigent, you didn't get a public defender. You got a court-appointed attorney from the local area. And in that case, Mr. John Paul Busby was appointed to represent Mr. Little Chief. And this was in 1975. Well, John Paul had been a solicitor at the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The judge in that case was Lyle Griffiths. He had been a solicitor at the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and he was the special judge assigned to the case who was going to hear the preliminary hearing. Early on, John Paul went to court, and Mr. Little Chief, he had mental problems. And on August I believe it was February 13th of 1976, they had sent Mr. Little Chief to the Western Mental Hospital in Western Oklahoma, the Western State Hospital. And that's where he was. So I got a hold of a friend of mine whose name became synonymous with CFR courts and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, whose name is Francis Oiltoin. Lives out West Anadarko, and her husband's name's Barney. Great people. And I asked Francis if she would ask John Paul if he would present a motion to dismiss on the basis of jurisdiction if we gave him one to do that. And he said he would think about it. Now, it's been a long time since this happened, so I had to verify this with Frances a couple of days ago so she could tell me the story again. John Paul thought about it for 3 days, and he called Frances back and said, if Ryland will prepare it, I'll present it. So, been out of law school a few months. We put together a short brief, 1-pager, along with a motion to dismiss, gave it to John Paul. And he presented it on July the 7th of 1976. The judge, after hearing the case, Lyle Griffiths, entered an order on August the 10th of 1976 dismissing the case. That was in the face of the Tuiska case that said there was no Indian country in Oklahoma. That case, right then, we knew if we could get it to federal court, would establish Indian jurisdiction in Western Oklahoma once again. So it rocks on. It takes a while, 1978, before we finally get the final orders. After the state appealed to the Court of Criminal Appeals, and we went to federal court, another happenstance happened. So we not only had a former solicitor that was appointed as his court-appointed counsel, not only did we have a former solicitor that was appointed as the judge to hear the case in Caddo County in that dusty little courtroom that nobody expected anything to ever come out of for any Indian. The federal district judge that was assigned to the case happened to be General Fred Daugherty. Well, time and circumstance. General Daugherty, during Korean War, wasn't a general, he was a captain, And he was my dad's commanding officer in Korea. So we knew him. Those little things can make a huge difference. We had an empathetic ear, and he found in our favor, and the 10th Circuit affirmed it. And Hez Bussey, who I used to work for and write opinions for, Blind Bussey, who was an Indian man who affirmed every case that ever came in front of him, had to agree that there was Indian jurisdiction and tribal jurisdiction in Oklahoma. And the state had no jurisdiction on tribal trust allotments. So after that happened, then we had this issue with jurisdiction because there was a whole area where there was no jurisdiction in state court or federal court, because the federal court simply had the Major Crimes Act. State court now has no jurisdiction. So what do? Well, as Arvo and Kirk said, they had to restart the CFR court. And in restarting the CFR court in Inaugural, Oklahoma, yeah, it's not as nice as they are now, but it was fun. The first 4 judges on the court were Browning Pipestem, Vincent Knight, whose son, I think now works with my son at the Comanche tribe as a judge, Howard Goodbear, Cheyenne Arapaho, and myself. We were given a trailer and that was stuck out on the back parking lot of the agency at the BIA. I'll never forget. It was great. It was a single wide trailer. You come in the front door, and they built a little where the kitchen counter was. That was our desk for our court clerk. Our court clerk was Frances Oiltoy, and we had another lady, a bailiff. We called her bailiff, and her name is Marina Estelle. She's a Caddo lady, nice person. So, so we start this court up, and it used to make me nervous wreck because my courtroom, or our courtroom, was the back bedroom in the trailer. There was no way out. The desk was like sitting here, the doorway was here, the desk was here, and we had to squeeze around to get in the back. And there was some big old boys came through there. And I always wondered what happened if they decided to just push that desk on in and just me inside of it. So anyway, that was always a lot of fun. And we worked in that trailer, and we had this young man named Arvo Mekanen that came in, and he was working his little self to death, trying to become a lawyer and doing a great job. And he had a great future. We knew that. One day we show up for court after a storm, and there was our court rolled up against the soil and moisture office, upside down. So that was the end of our trailer court. That was the end of that. And that's when they started and worked on the inside of the court. Well, I'm trying to keep this a little shorter to kind of keep y'all from being here too long, but just thinking about that, how it all started and how minimal it was and how much and how far it's become now. We have our Comanche tribal court. We have a Kiowa tribal court. I'm fortunate to work with the Cheyenne Arapaho people and their Supreme Court. They have a wonderful court system out there. Western Oklahoma has made strides beyond belief. In 46 years, we've done what it took America 150 years to do without much help. In fact, we've had to overcome every step of the way. As a result of the decision, though, that got this all started, tribes began to change. We got rid of our old constitutions that were foisted on us by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. You remember those old constitutions? One size fits all. Didn't matter what tribe it was, and they were really made for the reservations, not for us. So we got rid of the old constitution, started making new laws. Economic development takes place. We needed something besides grants. And where did we go? Well, we got a few bingo halls going. Things began to move. Economic development moved around. We started developing new laws to permit our tribes to move forward. What has that done for us? Well, our people are better educated. We have more employment. Our tribes have employment now. We're able to do more for our people. The opportunities in housing and with the tribal courts has just been amazing. So even though we're thriving now in spite of it all. to Whiskey be damned. That's over. And now, just like you heard from these two gentlemen over here, we have a shot to get our reservation area back. We probably have one good chance. And we're going to get it done. It may be that, you know, I'll be 75 my birthday. My friend over here, I think he said he'd be almost 80. We're going to be passing the torch along to other people, to younger people, to carry on. So as you know, as a group, we haven't always exercised the best judgment working together, but that's all coming to an end now. You can see the tribes pushing together. As I've heard it said, and my son hears me say this a lot, lots of good judgment comes from experience, and lots of experience comes from bad judgment. Well, I'll tell you this, we've had a lot of experience, and I think the judgment's going to be good. We have good tribal leaders. We have good lawyers. I don't know how many law students are listening that are KCA, but we'll welcome your help. We need you. We need you at home. So with that, I'm going to close. I'll answer any questions you have if you want to write something down. I want to thank you all. It's been a real pleasure having the opportunity I had, and I hope many more young people have the same opportunity I did to help move things along. And in the future, we're going to see our reservation status reclaimed. And I think it's going to be a big surprise to a lot of people, but it's going to happen. And it's obvious to me, based on what we've seen and what we know, that we have a case. And after we finish this case and have this done, our people will continue to develop and move forward. We have a long ways to go, but we'll get there. Thank you so much.
All right, we're going to take about a 3-minute break here. Before we get our next speaker up. The written materials again are on this Dropbox. So if you have a cell phone, you want to capture that, you're more than welcome to do that. If you're not able to access it through the email that went out. And then the other thing is, again, this is part of our Article 6 project. We have come a long way, and just as Ryland said, we had in 1978 the Little Chief case. Back then, there were no casinos, there were no tribal police, there were the tribal governments really didn't have any power or exercise their inherent authority. And often I'd explain it in the sense that it was like a candle, the light almost blew out. But because of these attorneys that took risks, that spent time, that donated their free time and worked at very minimal wages. The judges of the CFR court back then, their yearly salary was about $3,000 for a year, not very much. And to look to see where we've made it to today is just staggering. And it's important because we came up with this idea, and I've done a lot of research recently on the Osage tribe and learning about their history. And each tribe has its history. I didn't think that we'd ever had anybody capture our history. And so that's why we decided to do this today. And I'm very grateful to our speakers who've donated their time and effort to be with you. And again, we want our tribal membership to know our history. So I'm hoping that we may turn this into a video or a program. We put one together on the legal history of the Osage involved with the Osage Reign of Terror. So that's something that we're going to try to raise some funds to do. If we come up with about a 30-minute video that we can share and educate our own people, because a lot of us don't know that history. So I'd like to introduce now, are you ready? Stephanie Hudson Burkhart. Before I do that, I'm going to give one more code word, and that's Quana, Comanche chief. Stephanie is the vice president of the Oklahoma Indian Bar Association. She's a wonderful help. She is also the executive director of Oklahoma Indian Legal Services, also known as OILS. She's Kiowa. Her family comes from the Hobart area. And she's very well qualified and probably one of the most experienced attorneys that I know in dealing with tribal courts. So she's going to talk about things post Little Chief and things into the future. Stephanie.
Okay, Arvo, how do I get to my? Here we go. Okay, well, Arvo is helping me get my PowerPoint up. So like Arvo said, my name is Stephanie Hudson. I'm Kiowa. I grew up in Lawton, Oklahoma, and my father was Bob Hudson. He was editor of the Lawton Constitution. He was a copy editor. So our family, we always knew what was going on in Lawton because, you know, he always knew all the news and everything. He's Tokoi. So my mom is Frida Quacoot Hudson, and she grew up in Hobart, and her family's traditional, and the way that she brought me and my sister up is, you know, Indians will know this, is we were church Indians, and we went to the Lawton Memorial Baptist Church. Is that what it's called, Jacob? The Memorial Indian Baptist Church. That was it, over on Railroad and Coombs Road out there east of Lawton. That's the church that we grew up in. And the rest of my family, they were went to powwows and stuff. So we didn't so much when I was growing up. So a lot of Kiowas, when they meet me, they're like, now, who are you? Who is your family? And they'll recognize my family. My grandpa and my Uncle Richard Quacoot and everything, they'll recognize them and stuff. But with me and my mom, it's always like, now, who are y'all? That's who I am. My grandparents were Ernest and Helen Quacoot. And well, there's differences in the family of how we say it. When I was growing up, my grandparents always said Quacoot. And some of my other relatives, they'll say Quacoot. And there's different opinions about what that translates into. My mom always said that Quacoot translated into Frank Quacoot. My grandfather's father, they always said that he had a good name in Hobart. So it meant that, you know, he could get credit places. So that's what Quacoot meant, was what my mom said. But then my other relatives said that Quacoot meant red blanket. So I think it's like all names with tribal members. You've got different ideas about what your name is and everything. So that's who I come from. And my mom always taught me, and my grandma, primarily my grandma, taught, you know, say who you are, say who your family is, people want to know how you got to where you're at and why are you talking? Who said you could talk and speak up and everything? So that's who I am. And my grandparents are from Hobart. They were both born in Hobart and lived in Hobart. Those of you who haven't been to Hobart, Hobart is like its own unique universe. And it is very insulated. When you talk to other Kiowas and stuff, you'll say, "Oh, we're from Hobart," and they'll go, "Oh, yeah, that's way out there, isn't it?" Yeah, yeah. So we're the furthest out west Kiowas and stuff. The way I grew up was, lived in Lawton, went to Lawton High School, was at home, but a lot of the time we would go out to see my grandparents out in Hobart. And my grandparents lived on my grandmother's maybe grandparents' allotment. I gotta figure out exactly which allotment they live on right now. It was my grandmother's family. And they lived there. My uncle lived next door. My aunt lived across the road, and there were 15 cousins. And we all grew up together. And I remember, being in the back of my grandpa's pickup truck, and a whole bunch of the cousins were in the back of the pickup truck, and we were driving to Little Bow. Little Bow was some of the allotted land that they owned an interest in. It was a rock quarry, but they liked to go out there and just hang around and stuff. So there'd be 15 of us cousins in the back of the pickup truck, and my grandpa driving down what's called Ice Plant Road, 70 miles an hour, and we're all holding on and stuff. And that's terribly illegal now. I wouldn't even think about putting my children in the back of a pickup truck going 70 miles an hour. But all of us were going down there and everything. And what's so important about those memories is that land meant so much to my grandfather. That quarry land that he had Elk Creek. We're called Elk Creek Kiowas, and his property, he had an allotment. He still has, my family still has the land on Elk Creek, and he had a pecan grove down there, and he took care of that pecan grove. And some people remember going to my grandpa's house, and he would have family celebrations down at that pecan grove, down on Elk Creek and everything. And the land was so important to him. So when I was growing up and everything, and I said, I want to go to college and everything. He said, one time he said, you should think about law school. We need somebody who understands the land and everything. And I was like, that's a big thing to think about. So went to college, went to OCU. Bud Samant worked at OCU, and he was at some event in Lawton, and met me at some event, and he said, you should come to OCU and go to school at OCU. So I went because he was Kiowa, and I felt familiar. And I thought, it's good to go someplace where there's a Kiowa there. So all through my undergrad, he would always check on me whenever the bursar said, we can't enroll you because you still owe money. He would come and he would call the Kiowa tribe, and the Kiowa tribe would call, and they'd take care of my bill and everything. So it was good. It was a good place to be. So then I was out for 2 years, and then I thought, well, I guess I'll go to law school. So I went to law school and did all of my first year classes, was terrified, almost quit because I was just like, oh, this is too much. This is scary. I don't know that I can do that, but I went ahead and kept going. And looking at the lists of class and everything, there was an Indian law class. So I thought, well, I'll take the Indian law class. And lo and behold, who's the professor? Another Kiowa, Kirk Kickingbird. So Kurt Kickingbird was my Indian law professor. And so I knew my family history. I knew that my aunt talked a lot about Lone Wolf and Lone Wolf being an important person in our family and everything. And we should, respect Lone Wolf. She talked a lot about that. But one day I'm sitting in class and Professor Kickingbird's talking about the case that we had read for the day and everything, and about how it was just this seminal case in Indian law. And it, said that the United States Congress has the plenary power to make decisions about what's good for Indians. And I sat there and thought, Lone Wolf. And so I talked to my mom and talked to my family and everything, and they said, yeah, we think that's that Lone Wolf. So I did more research and found out that, wow, that's our family, that's my grandpa's grandpa is Lone Wolf. So that was just such a interesting connection to put that all together in law school with my Kiowa professor and everything, that's who Lone Wolf is. And the more that I've gotten into my law career, I've realized how important that case is. Okay, so that case says that Congress has the plenary power to basically make decisions about what happens with Indians. And that's why what Kirk and Arvo and Rylan were talking about, why that's so important, is because Arvo talked about the two cases that John Marshall decided back in the 1830s. It's called the Marshall Trilogy. And it's Worcester, it's cases from Georgia. And John Marshall, through the Supreme Court, said that Indian tribes, Indians, they have the ability to have their own sovereignty. They can have their own nations. But one thing you have to think about is that was something that the Supreme Court decided. The Supreme Court decided that. But then about 50 years, 50, 60 years later, 70 years later, the Supreme Court decided again in Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock. They said, yeah, tribes have sovereignty. Tribes can have their own nations. But when we're talking about land, tribes, you have to listen to what Congress says, and Congress has the plenary power to make decisions. So it's very important that we all understand we are sovereign nations. We can have our own nations, but Congress, the Supreme Court, still has a lot of power over that sovereignty. And it's important that we understand these treaties and we understand what these treaties are saying. What the Medicine Lodge Treaty says. And Kirk has spent years doing research about what the Medicine Lodge Treaty says. Arvo has been, dealing with jurisdiction and teaching jurisdiction for years. Rylan has been, representing tribes and representing individuals for years, and they understand how important it is for the tribes to have this basic understanding of what these treaties say. So this past year, not this past year, over these past few years, we've had all of these cases coming from the eastern part of Oklahoma, McGirt, and then I can't even think of all of the names of all of those Court of Criminal Appeals cases, but you've got McGirt with the Muskogee Nation, you've got the Cherokees and the Choctaws, you've got the Seminoles and the Chickasaws, Quapaws, Wyandots. I'm missing somebody right now who have what people call McGirt jurisdiction. So McGirt, that decision came about and it surprised a lot of practitioners because the Supreme Court it doesn't always make decisions that are favorable for tribes. And when the McGirt decision came about and said that the Muskogee Reservation was not disestablished, I think it surprised a lot of practitioners that that happened. What was exciting about that McGirt decision is how detailed the judges looked at the arguments about the treaties. They read the briefs that the attorneys had written, and whoever was working with the judges on the 10th Circuit and with Judge Gorsuch was from the 10th Circuit, so he understood Indian law. But whoever was working with them had read the treaties and understood the treaties and understood that the treaties were still in place and that Congress, remember Lone Wolf says that Congress has the plenary power to do what it wants to do. So Congress can disestablish a reservation. Okay, some reservations have been disestablished in Oklahoma. Congress outright disestablished a reservation. But with the Muskogees, what the judges looked at and said was that there had never been anything said by Congress to disestablish that reservation. Patty Palmer, Philip Tinker was one of our interns with Oils. They did an amazing job doing the research to show that the reservation had not been disestablished. So what Kirk showed was all of these references in congressional records saying that the Kiowa, Comanche, Apache land is a reservation. All of these references, and he's got them all listed here, is that Congress, you are calling it a reservation. You are calling it a reservation, Congress. So you need to recognize it. Arvo showed that there's a lot of evidence that the Jerome Agreement, which some of the attorneys are trying to use and say that, well, y'all gave away your reservation with the Jerome Agreement. And what Arvo's showing is that there's a lot of proof out there that the signatures, they're forged or they were coerced or they were, not the proper signatures. So there's a lot of evidence out there that the Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache reservation has never been disestablished. I've gotten to the point where I call it the reservation. If I'm talking to somebody, I call it the KCA reservation. All of us who drive in and out of Southwest Oklahoma, what do those signs say? They say entering KCA, it says entering Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache Reservation. So there's a lot of evidence out there that this reservation still exists. Okay, so the way that the way that the Muskogees got to the McGirt situation was it wasn't the Muskogees who did it. They never would have done that. The tribes would have never engaged in a situation to try to show that there was a complete reservation, that it wasn't just the allotments. The tribes wouldn't do that because that's scary. You don't know what you're doing. You can open a can of worms if a tribe starts to do that. It started out with some attorneys who said, I've got this criminal client and the state is either trying to put them in the penitentiary for life or going to try to execute them or something. So these attorneys said, the best way to try to come up with a defense is to say that the state has no jurisdiction. State has no jurisdiction because this happened on Indian land and this is an Indian person and the federal government has jurisdiction. And that's why I said Patty Palmer and Philip Tinker, they did an amazing job figuring that out. Philip Tinker, he started, doing some land research and doing some research on the land where these crimes took place. The case that preceded McGirt, Jimmy Murphy, was that it? I think that was it, Murphy. Murphy, he got murdered in a really heinous way, and his body was thrown off in a bar ditch and everything. But he went back and read all the reports and everything, and he figured out, looking at what the police said about where the murder occurred and where was somebody standing and stuff like that. He did all that research, and then he started researching the land, and he figured out that maybe this is Indian land. Indian land is very complicated because you have surface rights, you have mineral rights, you have people who've given away half of their mineral rights. And it's a very complicated puzzle to put together with Indian land. And they put all that puzzle together and then showed that, hey, this murder occurred on probably on Indian land. And so they made that argument. Then they made the argument that, Congress has never disestablished this. So the Kiowas and Comanches and Apaches, you've got cases in court like that right now. And they're moving up through the appeal system. And, I know that Kirk has been trying to help the attorneys by using this argument right here, showing that the treaty, that the reservation has never been disestablished. So that's working its way up through the appeals. And, that's the way that this is going to happen. Is, with these criminal cases that the tribe has no control over. That's the thing about these cases. I talked to some of my friends who worked with the Muskogee Nation, and they were like, we had no control over it all. It was just going through, and all we could do was, hire counsel to help the attorneys. And that was the best thing that could have happened was they hired counsel. The tribes hired counsel to be together with these criminal attorneys who are taking these cases up all the way to the Supreme Court and such. It would be good. It would be very good if the Kiowas, Comanches, and Apaches could have a ruling that's similar to what the 5 tribes have. Now, the 5 tribes, it went with the Muskogees, and then boom, 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 all the other 5 tribes. And it's because their treaties were really similar to each other. They, the 5 tribes, they always worked together when they were dealing with the federal government. They were called, we don't call them this anymore, the 5 civilized tribes. It's because they had been in the eastern part of the United States. I always say this when I talk to students. I always tell them, think about the United States. There have been Europeans in the United States since 1492 when Columbus came here. So before the United States became a nation, there were Europeans in, the eastern part of the United States for 400 years. So the five tribes, they had intermingled with the settlers, with the Europeans, and they had very sophisticated towns, very sophisticated governments, communities and such. So they did know how to negotiate with the federal government. So they negotiated some things with their land that were different than the Western tribes. The Western tribes, hey, we were still out there, going where we wanted to go and stuff. And so we were not as sophisticated with dealing with the US government. And there were areas where we probably got taken advantage of, like in the Jerome Agreement. So we have some opportunities to try to help maybe some of these attorneys who are taking these cases appealing these cases and reaching out to these attorneys and saying, hey, do you need help with research? What can the tribes provide with research? The tribes, y'all have counsel, and maybe that counsel can help help these attorneys as they take these cases up through appeals. Okay, so that's just a little about me, a little about my opinion about what Kirk and Arvo were talking about and everything. I see real opportunity. So let me talk just a little bit about, did I hit the wrong button, Arvo? There we go. Oh, there we go. There we go. There we go. Okay. So I'm talking about courts. So part of tribes being able to move on, to be able to build businesses, be able to build the tribe, is you have to have courts. So KCA, I'm going to start with Kiowas. So the Kiowa court, I'm excited. I'm really excited about the Kiowa court that was established January 1st, 2023. Okay. Chairman Spotted Bird, Vice Chairman Zotai, they did a great job in getting that court opened up, and oils, we practice in that court. Jonathan Rohr is the prosecutor over in the Kiowa court, and they are prosecuting people. They are taking care of disputes within the tribe, and it's terrific. I think a lot of the caseload over there is guardianships. I think there's a lot of guardianships that exist. There's a lot of the case. This is what I see with our caseload, with Oil's caseload. It's middle-aged people who are living with their parents, who are causing a ruckus with their parents and stuff. So, I really hope that as the Kiowa tribe grows, that you're able to provide more substance abuse help for tribal members. I think that's a big issue within Southwest Oklahoma, just in general. So I think that would be great. But the Kiowa court, it's moving along. There's different types of court. Law students learn that there's courts that have general jurisdiction, and then there's courts that have more limited jurisdiction. Right now, the Kiowa court, it has more limited jurisdiction just because it's still growing. It's like I said, it does a lot of family cases. It does criminal cases. I think that they're looking at having a wellness court at some point and other types of courts. So I think that's really great. The Comanche court. So when I started at Oils, the Comanche court was just a children's court, one of those limited jurisdiction courts. They only did guardianships, adoptions, child support. But now it's a court that is pretty much general jurisdiction. Any type of situation that goes on, they'll deal with it. They probably deal with a lot of offenses with the entertainment centers. A lot of things that are going on in the entertainment centers. They're stopping people for traffic offenses that are happening out there. So the Comanche court, it's doing a great job out there. So the Apache tribe, I don't believe they have a court yet. That's something that I think that they're probably going to be working on. If a case like McGirt happens within the KCA reservation, I think that that's something that all three tribes are going to have to look at, is how are you going to deal with the influx of cases that could come through. So I was talking with somebody that I know at the Choctaw court. No, it was the Muskogee court. Miko Factor's getting ready to go over there and be an intern there this summer. I think they said they had, before McGirt, they had something like a couple of hundred cases in 1 year. This past year, they had 12,000 cases. So the 5 tribes, they have had to just increase the number of court personnel that they have. Their courts are just huge now. Just the Chickasaw Nation court, they probably have a better court. Their structure of the court, it's probably better than most district courts that I've been to in Oklahoma. So their facilities are amazing. Seminole Court, Judge Barnes over here, they're having an open house next Friday for their new court. So how many cases did you increase? Have y'all increased? That's just one county. One county, Seminole's one county. You know, what I love about what's going on in the Seminole Tribal Court is that the Seminole County State District Court is going through big renovations right now, and the Seminole Tribal Court and the Seminole County District Court are sharing facilities. I think that's amazing collaboration. That's how it should be done. And our state leadership right now is having a hard time trying to see the collaboration. And hopefully, you know, by the time that the Kiowa Comanches and Apaches are ready to have a court like the Seminole Court, it'll be time for some collaboration with the state. I think that would be terrific. So what the Apaches are using right now is the CFR court in the Anadarko agency. Before the Kiowa court existed and before the full Comanche court existed, the CFR court had jurisdiction over any sort of legal cases that existed within the Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache reservation. It was the CFR court. Rylan Rivas are you still the prosecutor over there? Yeah, I bet you were happy to turn those cases over. But you still have jurisdiction over Apaches, Fort Sill Apache, Caddos, and Wichita. They still have jurisdiction over those tribes. Okay. So talking about preparing courts for the future, I think that it's important to start now discussions with the Department of Interior, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Department of Justice, those are the federal agencies, and then begin, talking to county law enforcement agencies, state law enforcement agencies, state district courts, municipal courts. And this is what I think is the most important thing for tribes to have. You need to have a well-staffed, trained, and funded tribal grants department, because there are so many federal grants out there for tribal courts, for tribal police, for just justice systems. There is so much funding out there. And with what's happening in the eastern part of Oklahoma, the Department of Justice has their eye on Oklahoma with funding. They have funding available. So it's so important to have that tribal grants department. Make sure that you have somebody who's well trained. There's certifications that you can get for people who do grants. And you want to make sure that the people have training in order to apply for federal grants. Okay, some of the things that Arvo and I were talking about that we should, briefly address while we're here talking about, possible changes in jurisdiction within the Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache Reservation. Some of the things that we've seen at Oils is we've seen issues with easements. Oils was co-counsel on a case called Davila versus Enable. And that was a situation where there was a disagreement between the landowners and the midstream company about what the agreement was going to be about the easement. And it was a disagreement that existed for 20 years. And Oils has seen more people coming in and asking questions about the easements and such. So that's something that, I think that, the tribes could possibly, think about, when you're developing realty offices and such, think about, how you could help tribal members understand some of the land issues that are going on. I bet Ms. Tippecani would appreciate it if there were more help with the tribal members. Ms. Tippecani was a superintendent over at the BIA, so she saw a lot of those. Grazing, we get a lot of people who have questions about, I see people on my land, I don't think that they're, should be on there. I think that, somebody's cows have gotten over and are grazing on my land instead of somebody else's land. Highway 9 is having this big change in going through Caddo County. And we got questions from people about, how is this affecting my land? They're wanting to take my land by eminent domain, and am I getting enough money for this and everything? Water. Arvo was telling me about this organization, this family organization that wanted to tap into the spring, the natural spring on his family's land. And water that, with climate change, water is always an issue. It's either too much or not enough all the time. So water is an issue with who is getting access to the springs, the natural springs that are on our allotments. Another thing about water is with climate change, we're getting too much water on some of the lands, and some family members need help with dealing with houses that need repairs and hail and rain, I always tell people that fire is not what is most likely going to damage your house. It's water that's going to most likely damage your house. You're going to get hail damage, you're going to get wind damage, and then you're going to start getting water leaks in your house. And then it's going to start deteriorating your house. And when you're a person who doesn't have money to repair your house, I don't always have money to repair my house. So, it's a common problem. Okay, my final area. This is my little, let's think about this. This is what I want to talk about. So these are some things that, the KCA could work on together. We do a lot of work with an organization called the Indian Land Tenure Foundation out of Minnesota. They provide funding for us to do a lot of estate planning. And they are very forward thinking in about what Kirk was talking about, the 100 million acres. Read that book if y'all get a chance to. It's a great book. The 100 million acres. And they're working with tribes on how to get back some of that land and how to put that land that's been sold or given away, putting it back into trust. One of the questions that we get a lot of questions about this because we do probates. And for a while there, on the 5 tribe side, land, it would be probated. And if it was inherited by a family member who was less than 1/2 of the 5 tribes, it would lose its Indian status. It would lose its restricted status. So they would ask, how do I put it back into Indian status? And we'd always say, well, with 5 tribes, the way that it works is you can't put it back into restricted status. So I always tell them, go talk to your council person. Go talk to your council person because land can be put back into trust. It's a little bit of a complicated process and you have to work with the Bureau of Indian Affairs on it. But the Choctaws, they are working with the Bureau of Indian Affairs and they are putting home sites back into trust. Sites that have lost their restricted status and they are putting them back into trust. So that's something for the KCA to think about is, land that was formerly trust land, how can you put it back into trust and how can the KCA either help individual families or how can it benefit the tribe? Like I said, protecting land from climate change, storms are different. I was listening to a story that said that there's not more tornadoes. The number of tornadoes are still the same. They said what's different is the amount of rain that's coming down in storms now. And they said what's different is the amount of straight line winds that are different. They said that these little storms that come up that are not tornadic are more severe. So you are getting a lot more family members that are having problems with their homes. Tribal partnerships. Like I said, we do a lot of work with the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, and they have some really interesting ideas about how tribes can work, tribes who are close together, how tribes can work on different types of land issues. Okay, and then finally, this is an idea I'm throwing out as I'm almost done with my time. So something that Arvo Mikkonen and Greg Bigler, he's not here, have been thinking individually about, and they each tell me about it, and I'm trying to get them to have one big think tank, is this idea that tribal sovereignty can go away. Somebody can take it away. Can the federal government take it away? Can the Supreme Court take it away? Who can take away this idea of tribal sovereignty? And Greg Bigler's been thinking about it a lot. And he said if that happens, then the fallback is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. That's what the fallback is. And he said that tribes need to be thinking about how to protect sovereignty. Back in the day, when I was in Professor Kickingbird's class, there was a think tank up at NARF, and that think tank, they thought about Supreme Court cases, and they advised tribes on what to take to the Supreme Court and what to not take to the Supreme Court. And I think in Oklahoma, there needs to be a think tank of how do we protect the tribes and how do we protect tribal sovereignty. And Arvo is trying to come up with something like that. Greg Bigler's trying to come up with something like that. So I think that's something that the KCA could come up with, is get your people together who are thinking forward. We've got our 2 KCA elders here who have given us lots of information. Arvo and I are, a couple of decades in, and there's a lot of young people who are graduating. My son graduated from high school the other day, and I'm constantly telling him about tribal sovereignty and stuff, and he knows all about it and everything. So we got to get our young people excited about this and help them understand we got to protect tribal sovereignty. Okay, so one last thing. Today is May 17th. May 17th, 1993 was the day Sac and Fox versus Oklahoma was decided in the Supreme Court. So all of us who are driving around with our tribal license tags, me probably illegally, so because I don't live in Kiowa jurisdiction, all of us who are driving around remember he just passed away. Truman Carter. Remember Truman Carter? Truman Carter was the Sac and Fox attorney who had somebody make him a license plate that said Sac and Fox Nation, and it had the number 1 on it. His son has it now. Had the number 1. He drove around out in Lincoln County, got arrested a couple of times, got his car towed away. He had to walk back home after his car got towed away. But he was the one driving around, and he was the one who started the case. He was the one who started the case. So now we have tribal license plates. We have tribal revenue. We have tribal revenue coming from those license plates. That's an act of sovereignty to drive around with those license plates and everything. So I want to leave y'all with that. And thank you very much. Aho.
Again, the idea behind this summit really was to capture the knowledge that we have, in our own tribe. We've got large number of attorneys, Kiowa, Comanche. I don't know if we have an Apache attorney. I've been trying to figure that out. I don't know of an Apache attorney, but hopefully there will be an Apache attorney graduate soon from law school. And the one thing that really struck me in doing this, pulling together these talented people and looking at the law is our history. And if we don't know where we came from, how do we know where we're going? I learned, excuse me, my voice is leaving me. I learned a whole lot looking at the history, and it was very motivational for me. Motivational on one hand, but upsetting on the other to see what happened, to our people, just like the story, involving the Osages. Nobody would have really delved into it had it not been for that movie, had it not been for that book, had it not been for the people telling our story. more often than not, we look in the newspaper, we read on TV how people out there say it's not fair. It's not fair to have a tribal tag. It's not fair for a tribe to have separate police. We should all be one. But the thing is, and this is why it's important for young people to know this and older people, how much we gave up. How much land we gave up. What if we had all those oil resources? What if we had all that land still? We gave that up. And, our people fought and died so that, we're to survive. And I think a lot of people around the turn of the century, they thought we would just go away. We would just melt in, we'd be gone. I'm sure if we were to go back 100 years, they would be just surprised to see where we are today. And really that's what we have to hold on to make us distinct, to make us unique, is this, concept of sovereignty. It's not illegitimate. It is written in black and white. And again, I always remind people, if you're going to talk about defending the Constitution, your Second Amendment rights, your First Amendment rights, you need to think about Article 6. And notwithstanding the fact that we don't have what we used to, we still have a lot of land. I mean, we have hundreds of thousands of acres of land. And, there are some tribes out in California, their reservation's 5 acres. My father-in-law has 160 acres still in trust. And we need to think about what Stephanie said, putting our land back into trust. The BIA will take it into trust for tribes. I'm challenging any attorney to tell me why the BIA cannot take land back into trust for an individual. Where's the law that says we can't do that? I don't think that there is one. So those are things to think about. Consolidating our land, getting back together again, working closely. Our alliance is over 200 years old. We need to work together. I know sometimes it doesn't seem like we're as organized as some of the other tribes, but the other thing that strikes me is that, we are a very small group of people, really. I mean, to think about what we've been through, we ranged over the plains. We were the driving force from Montana all the way down into Mexico. And in spite of, all that we've been through, we have arts, we have song, we have culture, we have all of these things based upon our sovereignty and sticking through all the adversity that we've had to deal with. Let me see, there might be a few questions. Let me look here. Okay, well, that's not a question. Let's look in the chat here. Okay, well, these are compliments. Thank you very much. We did have a question that somebody wrote out, and I'll take a look at those. And the question is, how do we convince the courts of our tribal sovereignty and jurisdiction? Because or can they be discarded by judicial or congressional decisions? I think what we've learned here today is, we need to be our own advocates, because if Ryland and Browning Pipestem and Francis Oldtoint and Bill Rice and Vincent Knight hadn't thrown together a court very quickly to put the CFR court in place, the argument back then was the tribes can't handle it. They can't have courts. They were going to Congress to say, give the state of Oklahoma jurisdiction over all these remaining allotments, because the tribes are not prepared. And, they volunteered their time, they got it together, and look where we're at now. Yes, I mean, and that's the argument that's being presented on the other side. Still, the tribes can't handle it. They don't have enough police. And the 5 tribes have really, they went way above even what we were able to get done through the CFR court and the BI police, in trying to show that, yes, we can handle it. You got to give us some time. The state of Oklahoma's had 110 years to get their court system together. How many years have we had? 2, maybe, 3 to get up to the same level. So that's why it's important for us to, as leaders, as tribal members, to share this information and to share our history. People should know what we've been through, because the other side, the anti-sovereignty folks out there, and there's a lot of them, they're going to say it's not fair. Okay, it's not fair to the rest of Oklahomans. It's not fair to other people. And where we should be saying, look what happened to us. Was that fair? I mean, in light of everything that you know now, and a lot of you probably hadn't heard about that. And that's really a compelling argument to say, this is what we've been through. And just, we're not asking for anything other than to be left alone and to carry forward with what has been promised to us. Those of you who have read the McGirt decision, I'm sure know the first line of the decision. And that's when the Supreme Court said, authored by Justice Gorsuch, at the far end of the Trail of Tears was a promise. And so it's important for us to let others know what was promised to us as well. So I'm going to go ahead and conclude. I think we're right at about 5 o'clock. I want to thank everybody for coming here, and I'm going to recruit right now in front of everybody. And I want to see your 3 hands go up. We're going to make a video. We're going to make a movie, a documentary. And I would say I couldn't have done it if I hadn't already done it for the Osage. So we need to have one for the KCA, and anybody else that wants to help in that effort. I would really appreciate your thoughts and input. We're going to go ahead and conclude. I want to make a quick presentation to these 3 panelists, but thank you so much for coming. Our plan is to, this has been recorded. The Oklahoma Indian Bar Association has a new YouTube page. And so we're going to upload this, edit it, and upload it to our YouTube page. We just uploaded recently, with the help of one of our members, a CLE just like this, about the Osage, what happened to them. So it's important for that information to get out there. So again, I don't know how to say it in Apache, but any Apaches here? Say aho uda. Thank you very much for coming today. We will be concluded, and I'd like to call these 3 up, and I want to give you something. Might have one already, but this is a painting that was done by Onsote. Okay, Onsote, it literally means big feet or Bigfoot. That was Dennis Belindo, and I saw this painting years ago. I own it, and I had these prints made with his family's permission. And this is in front of Saddle Mountain, those of you that recognize it. So I always think of this being the 3 tribes, these 3 chiefs. So one for each one of you. Thank you so much for helping. Dean Guzman.
One thing I forgot to mention, Little Chief. The upshot for Mr. Little Chief is he's an artist. He's not in mental institution. He's not in prison. He's an artist. You probably see his works if you have.
Wow, that's wonderful.
Well, I'm going to present one to the dean of the law school. So maybe we can, next time we come back, you'll see it framed up somewhere, or maybe in your own office. I don't know. Thank you so much. They really came through for us at the last minute to provide us access to their sound system and their technical capabilities, and to allow us to use this room free. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And we are adjourned. And if you want to stay around and visit and ask any questions, more than welcome to do that. And again, share this information with others. We're most focused on educating our next generation. Thank you.